Chapter 659. It was a strange sound wave that was difficult for ordinary people to detect. As it reverberated in the surrounding forest, the two ancient trees at the edge of Rusland village suddenly moved. A long, old, strange sound echoed in the forest. The two ancient trees that were 7 to 8 meters tall suddenly shook their bodies, and a humanoid face appeared on their withered trunks. Who woke me? You little elves, can't you let me sleep a little longer? One of the ancient trees shook its body, pulling its roots out of the soil with difficulty as it muttered. It spoke very slowly at first, as if it had not completely woken up from its deep slumber. However, when it stood up high, the speed of its speech returned to normal. Where did these little bugs come from? Why are there so many of them? The two dryads looked around with the face that appeared on the trunks, and finally realized that something was wrong. How was this a troublesome little bug? This was simply a terrible bug disaster. The two tall dryads shook their bodies, shaking off the black insects that were crawling all over their trunks. Then, they raised their thick wooden legs that were made from countless tree roots and tendrils, and stomped down fiercely. Dong, 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 dong. 4 dull sounds of wooden stakes smashing into the ground could be heard, and the thick wooden legs that were covered with circles of wooden veins stomped countless bugs to death. When the two dryads raised their legs again, their wide and flat feet were covered in purplish-black blood and stinking bug juice. Enemy! Enemy! Destroy the enemy! The two dryads roared angrily, taking large strides forward while attacking the swarm of bugs with all their might. The direction they were heading towards was where the tree flute sounded. Bug-Lich Bliss hid quietly in a corner of the battlefield, using his strange compound eyes to observe everything that was happening on the battlefield from afar. Together with the eye bugs that were circling around the forest, the entire area within a 5-mile radius of Rusland village was under his strict surveillance. As a Bug-Lich, he did not have the low-class hobby of being on the battlefield and enjoying the thrill of punching flesh like other wizards. To him, everything in front of him was just the final struggle of his prey before they were served on his plate. He was enjoying a gluttonous feast, and these were just his food. There was no need for him to compete with a group of food that was destined to be devoured just to show off his bravery. The only thing he needed to do was to wait for the food to be roasted just right before he swallowed it in one gulp. Looking at the two towering tree spirits carving out a bloody path among the swarm of insects, Bliss's insect head hidden in the shadows of the forest did not show any signs of anxiety or heartache. His purple compound eyes flickered in the darkness as he used the insectoid's unique method to control the insect swarm. Along the way, he had already destroyed 2 elven villages and countless animals and magical beasts in the illusory magic forest. It was by relying on the nourishment of their flesh and blood that Blitz was able to pull up this frightening insect army. However, even at this moment, when he had a terrifying insect army of up to 150,000 insects, he still hadn't reached his limit. With his current strength, even if he doubled the size of the insect army in front of him, he would still be able to control them perfectly. What was the evolutionary path of a Bug-Lich? Nobody knew. Strengthening his body might be a method that could allow him to transform into a fearsome and ferocious insect, allowing him to roam the battlefield and enjoy the joy of killing wantonly. However, doing so would put his body in the most dangerous situation at all times. With Bliss's personality, it was obvious that he did not like to show his face in public, nor did he care about any personal honor or disgrace. Hence, he did not hesitate to choose the evolutionary path of strengthening the insect swarm. That way, he would be able to control more insect swarms and bestow strange combat abilities to some of them. Moreover, as the insect swarm slaughtered and evolved, he, as the master of the insect swarm, would unknowingly become stronger. More importantly, due to his countless clones, he was almost immortal. As long as the insect swarm was around, he would never die. To Bliss, this was what attracted him the most. Such an evolutionary path was undoubtedly the most suitable for his personality. As the master of the insect swarm, he would not frown no matter how many of these low-level insects were killed. The only thing that could affect his attention was the battle insects with strange combat abilities. The battle insects evolved from the black beetles to the thorn scorpions, and then from the thorn scorpions to the current demonic mantises. Their attack power was also multiplied. On the tall platform in the treehouse, 3 demonic mantises formed a combat team and had already chased the 2 high-grade elves into a sorry state. Their lives were hanging by a thread. Seeing that the 2 tree spirits were planning to enter the fray to save the elves, Bug-Lich Blitz secretly gave an order. Within the canopy of the tall, ancient tree, streaks of black lightning formed a long series of afterimages, surrounding the 2 tree spirits from all angles. The massive swarm of insects was indeed a huge deterrent to the elves who had frail bodies. However, they were up against the tall and sturdy tree spirits. The insect swarm's frenzied gnawing could not deal any fatal damage to them in a short period of time. Therefore, when the 2 treants trudged towards the elves with heavy steps that shook the earth and mountains, leaving behind a bloody hole with each step, countless insects that swarmed up to their bodies were gnawing on their tough tree barks, making a rustling sound. However, the insect swarm also suffered heavy casualties from the tree spirits' counterattack. The 2 tree spirits that were taking large strides forward suddenly stopped. They lifted their fluttering faces and stared nervously at the black silhouettes that were rapidly approaching them. Unlike the insect swarm around them, these strange battle insects were the ones that could truly cause them terrifying damage. Hence, they could not help but be nervous. According to the classification of creatures in the Magus world, the tree warriors of the Elven Kingdom should be at the high grade of Grade 1, while the withered tree guards were at the beginner grade of Grade 2. As for the tree spirits that had yet to advance, they were at the quasi-wizard level. However, such a one-size-fits-all classification could not truly reflect the true combat abilities of the various strange creatures in the high magic world. Take the tree spirits in front of them, for example. They were still in their infancy stages and had yet to cross the first barrier of their lives. However, judging from their overall strength, they could easily take down a small group of Grade 1 sword dancers or elven archers, even with the title of quasi-wizard. Therefore, the insect witch Bliss did not underestimate the 2 dryads at all. He sent out a total of 16 demonized mantises right off the bat. The 5-meter-long body of the demonic mantis was like a bean sprout placed next to a potato in front of the 8 meters tall dryad. It looked inconspicuous. However, these 16 bean sprouts all had sharp fangs, as well as terrifying sickles that struck fear in the hearts of people. The 16 demonic mantises turned into 16 streaks of black lightning, circling around the 2 tree spirits. Once they found an opportunity, they would pounce on the tree spirits from behind, using their huge sawtooth size to chop off the tree spirit's outer skin. Wood splinters flew everywhere and sap splattered everywhere. The 2 treants let out muffled groans as they spun in circles. They waved the tough vines coiled around their bodies with their big wooden hands, trying their best to whip those black figures. Unfortunately, with their slow and clumsy movements, they could not harm the demonic mantises at all, even if they whipped the swarm of insects until their blood splattered and their carapaces scattered. Moreover, their random attacks revealed even more of their weak points. The 16 demonic mantises circled around the 2 tree spirits like a revolving lantern, pouncing on them from time to hack at them. Then, when the tree spirits raised their tree whips, they would quickly flap their wings and escape from their attack range. In less than a quarter of an hour, the tough tree shells of the 2 tree spirits, which were almost indestructible by swords and sabers, were already riddled with scars. There were terrifying, crisscrossing scratches everywhere, and many of them had already cut through the tree shells, directly injuring the insides of the tree spirits. One of the 2 tree spirits had a determined expression on its wrinkled face. It raised its thick right foot and stomped down fiercely. Following a dull thud, the entire ground began to tremble slightly. The tree spirit roared towards the sky. Under the urging of the huge life force in its body, its right foot, which was originally formed from countless intertwining roots and hairs, plunged into the soil. Then it turned into thousands of snake-like roots again, burrowing in all directions. In the next moment, the ground within 20 meters of the tree spirit cracked, and the soil tumbled. Countless roots reached out from the ground and tightly bound all the living things on the ground. This included an uncountable swarm of insects and 3 magic mantises that could not fly in time. "Galler, go and bring the elves away. Leave this place to me." The tree spirit roared angrily, urging its companion to leave quickly. The other tree spirit looked back at its companion that had chosen to sacrifice itself with a sorrowful expression. Finally, it turned around and walked towards the elven treehouse. It was abnormally tall. As long as it stretched out its arms and placed them on the ancient tree, the elves on it would be able to jump into the lush treetop with its fluttering branches. At this moment, the black swarm of insects had already forced the elves to the treetop of the ancient tree of survival. There, they were barely holding on to the last piece of pure land. In less than half an hour since the start of the battle, there were only slightly more than 20 elves left out of the 67. The rest were either dragged into the swarm of insects by the demonic mantises or lost their footing and fell off the ancient tree, swallowed by the swarm of insects. In short, all of them were doomed. Hence, when they saw the tree spirit coming to their rescue, they all leaped and climbed into the treetop of the tree spirit, escaping from the ancient tree of survival that was about to be swallowed by the black swarm of insects. After receiving the elves, the only remaining tree spirit waved its tree whip and its hands to drive away the entangled demonic mantises. It waded through the densely packed swarm of insects and trudged towards the depths of the forest with great difficulty. Behind its lonely figure, the tree spirit that chose to stay behind had already fallen silently. Chapter 660. The battle had gradually died down. The once peaceful Ruslan village had now become a terrifying region of the dead. Within a few kilometers of the village, there was not a single living creature that was taller than 5 centimeters. This was especially true for the area where the battle had been the most intense. Not only had the animals disappeared without a trace, but most of the plants had also been devoured, leaving behind a scene of desolation. High up in the sky, an eagle spread its wings and soared. It circled around Ruslan village many times before finally being unable to suppress the restlessness in its heart and dove into the sky. The eagle flapped its strong wings and quickly weaved through the forest. From time to time, it would lower its altitude to avoid the branches and lush vines of the ancient trees. Finally, with a flash of light, it had passed through the forest and arrived at the quiet valley where Ruslan village was located. The eagle's mind was agitated at the first sight. It almost lost control and crashed into a withered ancient tree. The eagle hurriedly circled around and landed steadily on the ground. After a strange distortion, it returned to its human form. Soph was a Grade 1 druid from Skywater City. His daily task was to patrol the dozen or so elven villages around the Iron Tree Forest, and Ruslan Village was undoubtedly one of them. Although Ruslan Village had a small population, because it was adjacent to the Iron Tree Forest, the ironwood produced here was an important strategic resource for the Elven Kingdom. Ironwood was one of the main materials used to make high-strength elven bows. To the Elven Kingdom, which had many archers, it was extremely valuable. Almost every 4 or 5 days, Soph would come here to take a look and chat with some of his old friends. He was also in love with the female elf, Ferlin, who was the archery instructor in Ruslan Village. He was madly pursuing her, so he came here even more frequently. However, today when he came here, he saw a scene of desolation after a great battle. Within the valley, all the greenery had almost disappeared. The earth seemed to have been trampled on, and there were signs of destruction and rupture everywhere. The tall ancient trees had all withered and withered, their roots exposed. There was no longer any vitality in their bodies. An especially tall ancient tree had fallen at the center of the village. Its broken body seemed to have been crazily gnawed by some kind of creature. The soft heart of the tree had been dug out, almost becoming an empty shell. "Athelai, It was one of the two dryads of Ruslan village, Athalai. Seeing Athal's tragic death, Soft's heart trembled. If even Athalai could die in battle, it would be even more difficult for the other elves to survive. Then Ferlin. Soft, who knew the surroundings of the Iron Tree Forest like the back of his hand, immediately came to a conclusion. This wasn't some abnormally ferocious magical beast that had come to the village, but an invasion from the outside world. Combined with the recent battle reports from the Elven army in Skywater City, Zoff dared to assert that the witches who appeared here were definitely those vicious and evil witches from the other world. Under normal circumstances, Zoff should have quickly retreated and rushed back to Skywater City to report the situation. He should have asked the Elven commander to dispatch more helpers and powerful druid masters to investigate and track the whereabouts of the enemy. However, Zoff was worried about Ferlin's whereabouts. After hesitating for a moment, he finally clenched his teeth and rushed into this terrible battlefield. The enemy might have already left for some time. Although there were traces of a fierce battle on the ground and in the trees, it was difficult to find any survivors. He couldn't even find a slightly larger animal. As a result, he could no longer use his animal communication skill. Although he could communicate with the remaining plants and ancient trees in the surroundings, these plants only had a simple and crude mind. Apart from the two simple words, enemy, insect, they couldn't provide any more detailed information. In the forest, Soph also picked up many broken black insect shells. He carefully put these clues left behind by the enemy into his bag, ready to go back and submit them. Suddenly, there was a faint movement on the platform of the towering tree hall. This couldn't help but make Soph extremely nervous. He clenched the oak staff in his hand and added a tree skin spell on himself. Only then did he gather his courage and rush to the platform. However, the scene on the platform almost made him feel like his eyes were going to pop out of his head. This seemed to be the main battlefield of the battle. The large wooden platform was full of blood and scratches. At the corner of the platform, near the tree hall, a female elf with a broken arm had been stripped naked. Her chest was pierced by an arrow and nailed to a tree trunk. Her body was white and smooth, and her breasts were erect. Her head hung down powerlessly, and her face was covered by her messy hair. The blood that flowed from her naked body gathered into a blood-red lake under her feet. Due to the long time, the blood had solidified into a dark red blood stain. It was a ghastly sight to see. Apart from her, there were no other elves' corpses on the platform. It was Ferlin. Almost instantly, Soph recognized the female elf's identity. He rushed over in excitement, but before he could touch Ferlin's corpse, he felt an evil wind above his head and on both sides of his body. For the 5 black figures rushed out from their hiding places, aiming for the young druid who had lost his mind. Relying on the natural defense on his body and the oak staff in his hand, Soph staggered a few times to block the attacks. Finally, he struggled to break out of the ambush of the demonic mantises. He rushed to the edge of the platform in one breath, and the oak staff in his hand hit the ground. At the same time, he threw out a bunch of strange plant seeds. As a green magical halo flashed, the scattered plant seeds in the air expanded into terrifying thorny vines in the blink of an eye, binding the 4 demonized mantises in place. Of course, this kind of thorny binding couldn't bind the demonic mantises for a long time. The demonic mantises waved their sickle-like forelimbs, cutting the thorny vines into pieces in the blink of an eye. Relying on the short time bought by the thorny vines, Soph quickly twisted his body, trying to transform into an eagle and fly into the sky. However, just as his transformation spell was about to be completed, a gust of wind blew behind him. An extremely sharp mantis forelimb pierced through his right chest and nailed him firmly to the floor of the platform. Immediately after, the back of Soph's head suffered a heavy blow, and he fainted without a sound. On the flat and spacious platform of the tree hall, figures of all shapes and sizes had gathered without anyone noticing. Mary, who hadn't shown her face for a long time, was proudly standing in front of the group in her blood-red armor. Behind her were the 3 blood knights led by Soros. The old fox, Vinlier, was still dressed like a middle-aged nobleman, accompanying Mary with a smile on his face. At the back of the group, there were 13 or 14 forest elves. They were both men and women, and all of them were tall and handsome, valiant and heroic. However, at this moment, their eyes were bloodshot and filled with viciousness. Two sharp vampiric fangs protruded from their upper lips, and they looked like fiends. These forest elves that Mary had captured and transformed into blood thralls were all carefully selected. Even the weakest of them had the strength of a grade 1, and there were 2 grade 2. After the transformation of sucking blood, the original force of nature in their bodies had now been transformed into blood wizard power. They were no longer the forest elves of the past, but a strange species that had never appeared in the Faron Plain, the Blood Elves. The direct result of this transformation was that the power of the Blood Elves, who were originally sword dancers or archers, didn't decrease too much. Instead, because they had the ability to absorb blood, regenerate, and attack, they were much more terrifying in battle. Instead, the original spellcasters, druids, and elven mages, after being transformed into blood elves, lost all the natural magic they had mastered, leaving only the pitiful blood bullet spell. It seemed that if Mary wanted to increase the number of spellcasters among her subordinates, she would have to give them more time to slowly explore new blood magic. Fortunately, when Mary reached grade 2 in the Magus world, she had already transformed herself into a pure-blooded vampire. This way, most of the bloodline shackles on her head had been removed. At least before she reached grade 3, she wouldn't have to worry about this problem. The greatest benefit of transforming into a pure-blooded vampire was that the number of bloodline descendants that her soul could bear had more than doubled. This also meant that the number of blood thralls she could create would be as high as 30, and the number of low-level vampiric spawns would be as high as 200. If she gave up her authority and allowed her blood thralls to create as many vampiric spawns as she pleased, then, as the Blood Queen at the top of the pyramid, she could directly or indirectly control 1,000 to 2,000 blood creatures. A pure-blooded vampire could control a terrifying army of vampires, and a family of vampires that could even control a medium-sized human kingdom. However, this kind of behavior rarely happened in the Magus world. The main reason was that it was difficult to find such a large number of high-quality intelligent races. If the vampires lowered their requirements and thought of ways to embrace the weak humans, even if they could create an army in a short period of time, they wouldn't be able to withstand a large-scale attack from the enemy. Moreover, the embrace consumed the vampire's blood essence. Using the precious blood essence on some low-level creatures not only wouldn't help them become stronger, but it would also drag down their accumulation of power. Chapter 661. At this moment, the tiny Ruslan village had become a gathering place for the vampires and black bugs. A black ocean was wriggling on the ground, and within the tall treetops, groups of vampires would come and go from time to time. Under their protection, the leaders of both sides were quietly discussing something on the platform of the tree hall. Even though he had gathered an army of tens of thousands of insects and had the protection of 25 demonic mantises, the insect Lich Bliss was still very respectful in front of the Blood Queen Mary. He didn't dare to show the slightest bit of complacency and arrogance. With this insect army and bugs that he could command like an extension of his arm, Bliss could take on all the rank 1 Magi of the Crimson family by himself. But even with such power, he still did not dare to act rashly in front of Mary. Apart from the fact that she was a rank 2 vampire, Mary's actions during her apprenticeship had left a deep mark on his soul. Bliss' legs would cramp up and his palms would sweat when he saw Mary, forcing a smile on his face. He was even more respectful than Winlil. After half a month of sweeping, the two of them had visited almost all the nearby elven villages. When their strength began to increase, they were no longer satisfied with these sneaky little fights. This time, they purposely chose to meet here so that they could gather enough forces to launch a sneak attack on the outskirts of Celestial Water City, an elven town southwest of Celestial Water City, Quelryn's Hut. It was more than 200 miles away from Celestial Water City and had a resident population of about 400 elves. It was one of the satellite towns of Celestial Water City and was mainly responsible for supplying large amounts of fresh fruits to Celestial Water City every day. Most elves were vegetarians and would not touch greasy or fishy meat for their entire lives. Hence, the fruits provided by Quelryn's hut could be considered the main source of food for the residents of Celestial Water City. It was with this in mind that the old fox Wenlil urged Merry and Bliss to work together to take down this significant elven town after they met in Rusland Village. Taking down Quelryn's hut would not only greatly increase their forces, but also disrupt the order of life in Celestial Water City. For the two ambitious magi who wanted to make a name for themselves on the West Coast, this was something they had to do. Moreover, the highest level of defense in the Quelryn's hut was only Grade 2, and there were no Grade 3 powerhouses. Attacking such a region wouldn't bring too much risk to them. Therefore, after listening to Wenlier's analysis and introduction, Merry and Bliss couldn't help but feel a little tempted. This was the advantage of the cooperation between the two sides. Once a decision was made, it could be carried out almost instantly. As soon as the agreement was made, Bliss whistled and disappeared into the jungle with a swarm of insects. On Merry's side, the sound of wings flapping could be heard. Nearly 1,000 vampiric bats gathered into a red cloud and stuck close to the treetops of the forest as they flew towards a distant place. After a short moment, the quiet valley that had been ravaged by the soft feet finally calmed down completely, and only a deathly silence remained. On an isolated island overseas, the giant floating airship was still floating above the isolated island. Clanking sounds, sizzling sounds of welding, and all sorts of strange sounds of metal colliding and rubbing could be heard continuously. The previous battle left too much damage to the giant floating airship. For the sake of future battles, no matter how impatient Grimm was, he could only obediently squat on this small island that was less than 2 miles in circumference and slowly wait for the moment when the repair of the giant floating airship would be completed. At this moment, inside the giant floating airship, all sorts of engineering robots under the command of the goblin technicians and engineers were repairing the spatial furnace and the internal damage of the airship day and night. They were also repairing the shocking battle marks on the flight deck. The amount of work required was simply astounding. Fortunately, before entering the Farron Plain this time, the giant floating airship had stored a sufficient amount of metal ingots and alloy materials, so they were not at a loss. Otherwise, they could only quietly return to Shadow Island and seek help from the Pale Witches. The Magi obviously couldn't stand such a noisy environment, so they all chose to move to the isolated island. There, they used the short intervals of battle to continue some experiments and research that interested them. In the lower level of the isolated island prison, Grimm ordered people to dig out a small stone room and set up a temporary laboratory inside. What he urgently needed now was the forest elves. Humans, elves, dwarves, orcs, halflings, pygmies, kobolds, goblins. The same race that landed in different regions would undergo a tremendous change. As a magus, although Grimm thought that he had a good understanding of the elves, that was only from books from the Magus world. The elves that Grimm knew from books alone included wood elves, golden elves, sun elves, moon elves, gray elves, wild elves, grassland elves, forest elves. When a certain elven race was placed in extreme environments, they would even mutate into new and unrecognizable forms. For example, the dark elves, also known as drow, that lived in the underworld all year round, the sea elves, also known as naga, that lived in the deep sea, and the fallen elves, also known as satyrs, that lived in the enchanted region. The elves who lived on Callan Continent called themselves the forest elves because they lived in the magic forest. They basically continued the tradition of the elves and based their foundation on odd joie's archery skills. Regardless of gender, all the forest elves were tall, intelligent, beautiful, graceful, and sharp-eyed. They loved poetry, literature, and music the most. They usually lived in groups deep in the forest, and the largest clan rarely had more than 200 people. The forest elves' secret villages were ingeniously integrated with the forest and did their best not to harm the forest itself. Almost all the forest elves were vegetarians. They usually only gathered some natural fruits for food and rarely hunted forest creatures. Thus, unlike humans, they didn't cut down trees or burn weeds to open up farmland. It was precisely because they had completely integrated themselves into the magic forest that they were praised as children of nature and friends of the forest. Relying on this strange racial talent, they could travel through the magical forest that was filled with thorns, bushes, vines, and enchanted plants without leaving a trace. The forest, which was difficult for outsiders to traverse, was no obstacle to the forest elves. They could even talk intimately with every flower, every blade of grass, and every tree in the forest. Thus, it was almost impossible to track the forest elves in the magic forest. That was basically all Grimm knew about the forest elves. Apart from that, he had a rough idea of the forest elven army's professions and their characteristics. Overall, Fane Plane was a fairly well-developed middle-level plane and wasn't qualified to be mentioned in the same breath as the sorcerer world. Although the classification of creatures here was similar to that of the Magus world, in terms of quality, it was far too different. After experiencing several battles, large and small, Grimm estimated that the creatures here were half a rank lower than those in the sorcerer world. That was to say, the Grade 1 junior fighters in Fane Plane were only slightly stronger than the senior apprentices in the sorcerer world and barely on par with associate sorcerers. Oftentimes, the Grade 1 Fane Plane couldn't even compare to the powerful associate sorcerers in the sorcerer world. It was no wonder that Grimm, a Grade 2 junior fire wizard, could fight multiple Grade 2 Fane Plane creatures at the same time and even beat them into a sorry state. However, the forest elves of Fane Plane were not all weak. They had their own advantages and strengths. Every single forest elf was a soldier. Almost every forest elf, even those who were taller than a longbow, would be one of the best archers in the human world. Relying on this unique racial talent of being an archer, the forest elves had firmly occupied the Callan continent and had repelled many invasions from the Fane continent. Moreover, the forest elves were a powerful race protected by gods, and there were many divine spell users in the kingdom. These temple priests and elven oracles could mostly borrow the divine power of gods and combine it with their proficient natural spells. They had some terrifying power. In the previous battle with Jinthalor, the elven oracle Sinia, who was also Grade 3, had beaten the Dark Witch Uzzis so badly that she had to run away like a rat. If Grimm had not summoned the Grade 3 Thunder Dragon in time and used it with the magic cannons of the floating ship, that battle would have been the last for the Crimson family. With Grimm's strength, he might have been able to escape, but most of the sorcerers who followed him would not be able to escape the pursuit of the forest elves. It was because he had seen the terrifying power of the elven oracles that Grimm had once again fled overseas and used the opportunity to hide on an isolated island to search for the weaknesses of the forest elves. What he wanted to do now was to completely understand the body structure of the forest elves and how their magic organs worked. He wanted to find the simplest and most practical way to kill them. Of course, the number one priority right now was the plague. After all, this was not a private plane under his control. Even if he destroyed the Callan continent and reduced the number of forest elves, he would not be the one who would feel the pain. Chapter 662. In a dark and damp underground stone chamber. A stone dissection table was placed in the middle of the stone chamber, and a beautiful female elf was lying flat on her back. Her clothes and equipment had been removed and thrown to one side. At this time, she was almost naked, and there was nothing on her slender body to cover up. A strange rune had been drawn on her forehead with blood-red paint. Under the influence of this rune, the female elf could not control and direct her body even though she was conscious. Her entire body seemed to be disconnected from her consciousness. She could clearly feel the existence of every part of her body and could even feel the chill of the cold air brushing past her exposed skin. But strangely, she could not control any part of her body. She could not even complete the simple action of closing her eyes, let alone moving a finger. Her eyes were wide open, and her beautiful clear pupils revealed an unconcealable fear and unease. the environment, the atmosphere, and the two black figures who stood in front of the dissection table and examined her body expressionlessly. All of this made the female elf so afraid that she wanted to scream. But when the female elf wanted to scream in fear, she found that her mouth seemed to be stuck with strong glue and could not open it at all. Her throat was not under her conscious control at all, making it difficult for her to even make a vague sound. It's a good material, but it's just a simple dissection. There's no need to waste a grade 1 elf. Ender, who was standing beside Grim, muttered in a low voice as he stared at Grim through his muddy, yellow eyes. In her arms, there was a strange green puppet the size of a palm that was playing with the front of her clothes. On her shoulder floated a strange-looking black puppet. From afar, the black puppet looked like a small human figure made from black cloth. The surface of its body was covered with crooked, sewing threads and some indiscernible dark runes. Its small head did not have any concave or protruding features, and only had a terrifying single eye drawn with blood. The black doll had no limbs, and it floated eerily on Ender's shoulder. 3 green light spots hovered around its petite body. If someone could climb up close and take a closer look, they would be horrified to discover that the 3 green dots were actually 3 extremely miniaturized, terrifying ghosts. They did not have bodies, only horrifying ghost faces made of pure negative energy. They shrieked and howled at every moment, trying to escape from the body of the ghost puppets. However, he was still unable to fulfill his wish. Therefore, they resented, screamed, and cursed every living thing in the world. If one were to get a little closer to them, they would be able to feel the cold and gloomy aura assaulting them. After a period of nurturing, Grimm's plague spirit and sewing puppet had barely reached the Tier 1 basic standard. Moreover, both of them possessed particularly frightening abilities. Unfortunately, with their current strength, they were still unable to help him at all. He could only continue to nurture them slowly. Perhaps when they were upgraded to high-grade Tier 1, they would be able to be of some use in battles between Tier 2 powerhouses. For some reason, the 2 helpers that Grimm had nurtured were extremely compatible with Ender. Whenever Grimm released them, they would cling to the old witch's side as if Ender was their master. This made Grimm feel extremely helpless. After all, Ender had a unique dark body, which was similar to the 2 little fellows. On the other hand, Grimm had a pure body of flames, which belonged to the category of positive energy. It was no wonder that the 2 little fellows did not like him. After years of nurturing as a sorcerer, Grimm had completely assimilated into the rhythm of a sorcerer. He put on a plain gray robe and stood expressionlessly in front of the stone platform. His eyes were faintly emitting an intimidating blue light. Even though there was an alluring beauty in front of him, he did not show any signs of excitement or excitement. Instead, he was flipping the female elf's fingers and arms with great interest. The muscles aren't strong enough, so there might be a loss in strength. However, the lines of the muscles are smooth, which should compensate for the flexibility and coordination. The bones are too thin, with only 76% of the calcification of a human's bones. The weight is also 33% lighter than a human's, and the resistance is estimated to be reduced by 21%, the flexibility increased by 48%, and the coordination increased by 52%. Grimm was like a professional appraiser. He stretched out his slender white fingers and gently stroked the female elf's limbs, waist, chest, and other parts of her body. He even raised the female elf's hands and carefully observed the position and thickness of the calluses on her palms and wrists. This is a pretty good elven archer. The degree and position of the calluses on her left and right hands are not much different, which means that both her hands are equally flexible. However, from the way she spins the cocoons, I can see that she still likes to use her right hand to hold arrows and her left hand to wield a sword. Grimm slowly explained his opinion as he examined the female elf. Ender the poison centipede was whispering to the 2 little fellows, not paying attention to what Grimm was saying. Only the blue pupils of the female elf kept contracting. She was clearly terrified to the extreme, but her body was still stretching smoothly without any physiological reaction that should have been expected. You're probably wondering why we blocked your control over your body, but didn't anesthetize your consciousness, right? Grimm carefully examined the female elf's body and finally met her gaze with satisfaction. The female elf's gaze revealed a questioning look, but she still did not move. The reason is simple, Grimm said calmly, because when we dissect you, we need to know how the magic organs in your body communicate with your consciousness. During this process, I don't want your emotions to interfere with the surgery, nor do I want you to completely lose consciousness. That way, we won't be able to find out how the magic organs operate and work under your consciousness. So, let the surgery begin. As soon as he finished speaking, Grimm raised his hand, and a shiny silver scalpel was inserted deep into the female elf's chest. As Grimm gently moved the scalpel downwards, a bone-chilling sound rang out, and the female elf's chest was ripped open like a book. What followed was an abnormally cruel and bloody dissection. In order to understand the internal structure of an elf's body and how their consciousness worked, Grimm used a restraining rune to restrict the female elf's consciousness to her brain. This way, the physiological reactions of her body could still be clearly affected by her consciousness, but she could not control her body normally. The terrifying pain of her flesh assaulted the female elf's consciousness in waves. Her eyes were clearly rolling back from the pain, but her face was still calm. Grimm extended his hands into the female elf's chest and gently searched inside. From time to time, he would bring out fresh organs dripping with blood. All the organs were carefully placed into glass containers of various sizes and colors. They were all filled with a light yellow nutrient solution that could maintain the organ's activity for a short period of time. Heart, liver, spleen, lungs, kidneys, stomach, intestines, Grimm's hands nimbly cut. Every time he cut a blood vessel, he would flick his fingers, and suddenly, a small flame would be ignited to seal the bleeding point. This way, the female elf would not die from excessive blood loss. Moreover, under the stimulation of a strange spell, the female elf's chest was almost completely dug out, but she still did not die. Instead, her consciousness was still conscious, and she had to endure torture that was far more terrifying than death by 1,000 cuts. After examining all the internal organs of the female elf, Grimm regretfully shook his head. It seemed that she was just an ordinary elf archer without any talent in magic. In her body, there were no obvious signs of demonization in any of her internal organs. Grimm hesitated for a moment. It seemed that if he wanted to study the relationship between forest elves and nature magic, he would have to dissect the druids. However, since this elf was going to die sooner or later, he might as well make use of her to the fullest without hesitation. Grimm took out a small knife, a small hammer, a small chisel, and other surgical tools, and carefully opened the female elf skull. After being tormented to this extent, even with the stimulation of spells and the support of potions of life, the female elf's life could not stop slipping into the abyss of death. With a wave of his hand, Grimm activated several surveillance spell formations that he had set up at the last minute and began to examine every inch of the female elf's brain in detail. Grimm then gently wiped away the imprisonment runes on the female elf's forehead and whispered in her ear in a seductive voice, "At the last moment of your life, use all your strength to pray to your god." The female elf, whose consciousness was already a little muddled and had clearly fallen into a mental breakdown, suddenly regained a trace of spirit. Her lips squirmed, and with a voice as soft as a mosquito's, she prayed wholeheartedly to her god. A strange force that was hard to detect spread out from the female elf's consciousness, and through some special spiritual nodes in her brain, a mysterious and obscure path of faith was established in the distance. The moment the path of faith was opened, Grimm's heart trembled. He felt an indescribably powerful spiritual will rapidly extend through the path of faith. The surveillance spell formation near the female elf's brain immediately turned from yellow to dark red, and a strange alarm sounded. Besides the surveillance spell formation, Grimm also squinted his eyes, using the Chip's detection and penetration abilities to their fullest. With the two combined, Grim quickly locked onto the location of the Path of Faith. Asterisk Pa. Asterisk a small fireball exploded at the location he had locked onto, completely annihilating the last trace of the female elf's consciousness. As the female elf's consciousness dissipated, the Path of Faith disappeared as well. Chapter 663. Callan Continent, Central Mountain Range. The main temple of the god of the elves. It was a peaceful and beautiful morning. The bright red sun had just revealed a corner of the horizon, and the thin forest fog had yet to completely disperse. Some pious elves were barefooted with their hair down, picking leaves and rolling them into cups to catch the sweet dew falling from the branches. This would be their first gift to the great god of the elves that day. However, just as they were happily doing this, a powerful wave of consciousness suddenly erupted from the main shrine of the god of elves in the distance. It was so powerful that it covered the sky and covered the earth. The moment this consciousness forcibly descended upon the main temple, the entire central mountain range erupted with blinding golden light. Under the golden light, a beautiful female elf with a body of thousands of meters tall appeared in the sky above the main temple of the god of the elves. She looked to the southwest and let out an angry roar. It's the elven goddess Sylvia. The great elven goddess Sylvia has descended. After a moment of shock, all the forest elves who witnessed this scene immediately realized that this sacred and beautiful elf shadow was the main temple of the elves that they had prayed to countless times. In the forest, among the flowers, on the branches of the ancient trees, in the tree houses, all the forest elves put down what they were doing and knelt before Sylvia's divine will. In an instant, elven hymns of different styles and intonations, but all of them were filled with praise and prayers. The hymns gradually converged into a strange, powerful force that infused into the towering divine silhouette above the main shrine. The elven goddess Sylvia suppressed her anger and bent over to look at the thousands of faith nodes that lit up one after another in the central mountain range. She thought for a moment, and then the shadow dissipated into specks of golden light that merged into the tall statue in the main temple. With a flick of her finger, under the devout prayers of the many priests in the temple, the huge statue that was 5 meters tall and made of the rarest magic metal opened its eyes and came to life. Lara, what's happening on the west coast of the Callan continent recently? The statue's gaze quickly fell on Lara, the elven priestess who was kneeling at the front. Great elven goddess Sylvia, a new witch calamity has begun. Oh, we've already taught those evil witches a lesson last time. Do they still dare to invade the Callan continent? The statue asked doubtfully. In her beautiful round eyes, one could vaguely see the lightning and thunder before the storm. No. Priestess Lara hesitated, not knowing how to explain the information she knew to the goddess. The scale of the witch disaster this time is much smaller than before. Those evil witches seem to have focused their main force on the foreign continent. I heard that they have already invaded the Black River Valley and wiped out the Gustons who were entrenched there. They're currently fighting with the allied human forces near Thunder Mountain. The specifics of the battle have not been reported back yet. So who are those people near our coastline? According to the information we've gathered, a coalition of witches has come to the Callan continent, and the main force is still those evil pale witches. But this time, it seems that the Dark Witch and the Destiny, which are also cooperating with the Pale Witch. Their main forces are currently entrenched in the Echo Islands and are confronting our allied forces. There isn't much intense fighting. The Echo Islands are on the southeast coast. I want to know what happened on the southwest coast. Why are my believers being tortured and killed there? Southwest coast. His followers were tortured to death? These heavy pieces of information exploded like a silent bomb, causing Lara and the other divine temple priests to feel dizzy and confused. As the representative of the elf god in the mortal world, it was the basic duty of the temple priest to manage the flock of sheep for the god. Although the elf queen's authority was great, she still had to behave humbly in front of the temple priest. After all, The divine decrees of the gods could only be delivered through the mouths of the priests. Because of their high status, the priests of the Temple of Light would be involved in all matters in the Elven Kingdom, big or small, as long as it was related to faith and believers. But today, the Lord God was enraged and had even personally sent down a divine, incarnation. But the group of temple priests knew nothing about what the Lord God was concerned about. No matter what, this was a dereliction of duty. As the temple priests looked at each other, wondering what had happened on the southwest coast of the Kalan continent, an elf girl kneeling in the corner of the temple raised her head and said in a low voice, "Great Lord Silsa, I might know something about the southwest coast." The goddess statue's gaze instantly swept over them. One look at his attire, and it was obvious that he was an apprentice priest who had just been selected from a local shrine to join the main shrine. "What's your name?" The goddess showed a gentle smile. "Tell me, what do you know?" "Master Overlord, my name is Melissa from Skywater City. It's close to the west coast, and I have a friend, a Silver Pegasus Knight. He was seriously injured at the front line and just returned to the Central Mountain. I learned about the southwest coast from him." "What did he say?" "He said that the most dangerous thing about the witch disaster is not the Pale Witches, but a group of strange troops that split from the Pale Witches. They have a giant metal airship that can fly high above the clouds, and they can appear in any corner of the Kalan continent at will. Their numbers and strength were not too great, but they were unusually agile and mobile. Recently, many villages on the west coast and south coast have been attacked by them, and the number of brothers and sisters captured is hard to count." "Metal airship? Which troops?" The goddess pondered for a while and finally spoke again. "Call your friend into the temple. I want to know more about the situation there." "All right, you can all leave now." Under her command, the priests immediately withdrew from the temple in fear and trepidation. When the goddess was the only one left in the temple, she turned around and looked at a corner of the temple area, a trace of confusion in her eyes. "Why did Miwei send a clone down? Did something happen to her?" With just a thought, the divine will attached to the statue instantly arrived at the main temple of the goddess of moonlight. In the main temple of the goddess of moonlight, Miwei's clone was meditating with her eyes closed. Suddenly, she opened her eyes and looked in the direction of the main temple of the goddess of elves. After a while, Miwei suddenly bowed slightly and greeted with a sweet voice, "Welcome, great Lady Silsa." The next moment, a hazy shadow appeared in her temple, and then revealed Silsa's sacred and beautiful face and body. "Sister Miwei, you are too polite." Silsa had only sent a divine will clone, but under the constant attention of the main body, this divine will clone was actually no different from her original body. Thus, even if Miwei was in her main temple, she still had to treat her with respect. Silsa stepped forward and pulled Miwei to sit down peacefully on the two flower chairs that quietly floated in the center of the temple. "Sister Miwei, this time I sent my divine because of some matters on the southwest coast. I wonder why you sent a doppelganger here?" They were all from the same elven divine system, so she naturally didn't hold back when speaking. So Silsa asked directly. A bitter smile appeared on Miwei's face. "I had no choice but to send a clone. My only god's messenger was killed by a group of outsiders a few days ago. As members of the elven divine system, these elven gods were close partners, and at the same time, they also had a relationship of open and secret competition. As the main god of the elves, Silsa naturally had nothing to worry about. Almost all the forest elves were her believers. Even the devout believers of the other elven gods were basically her shallow believers. But she did not need to worry about the amount of power of faith, which the other elven gods obviously could not do. Although these elven gods usually had a harmonious relationship, and in private they were also very harmonious, when it came to matters concerning believers, they would not give in an inch. After all, the number of believers and the degree of faith directly affected the level of the god's divine power. Unpopular gods like them had very few believers to begin with, and even fewer could reach the level of devout believers. Under such circumstances, it would often take hundreds or even thousands of years of hard work to train a god's messenger to become a fanatic believer. Silsa, on the other hand, had as many as 3 or 4 God's messengers under her command. Even if one of them died, it would not affect the development of the temple. Thus, after the death of the only God's messenger of the Moonlight Temple, Mi, in order to prevent her believers from losing faith, had to send a clone even at the cost of continuous divine power. But this way, most of the power of faith that the temple gathered every day had to be supplied to the clone in order to maintain her consumption in the Faron Plane. This way, the power of faith that could be supplied to the divine kingdom in heaven would be greatly reduced in the long run. It would undoubtedly cause unrest in the divine kingdom. It would also affect the divine spells that the Moonlight Goddess bestowed upon her believers. Thus, if not for the fact that she had no other choice, the Moonlight Goddess, who was originally from a small family, would not have been willing to send this clone down. The God's messenger was killed. Silsa's gaze froze. Where? Near the west coast? Hearing Silsa's words, Mi could not help but narrow her eyes. At this moment, she seemed to have vaguely realized something. Looks like we have to properly exchange information. If it was really done by the same group of fanatics, I will definitely make them regret it, Silsa said hatefully. Chapter 664. Quilling's Hut. Compared to ordinary elven villages, this place was much more lively and bustling. Since it was adjacent to Tinshui City, elves who wanted to go to this famous city on the west coast had to pass by Quilling's Hut. Hence, this place became a beautiful town where travelers couldn't help but stop and rest. Within the Elven Kingdom, there were very few large chambers of commerce like those in human kingdoms. Most of the trade of goods and resources were conducted in the form of barter in small areas. Most elves had long lifespans, and they were passionate about music, painting, flowers, and gardening. They had very low requirements for material things, and most of the time, they pursued a self-sufficient, perfect life. While humans bitterly lamented that life was too short and were busy pursuing money and power, the elves liked to travel around the Kalan continent as they pleased after they grew up. They drank some dew when they were thirsty, picked some wild fruits when they were hungry, and found a random branch to sleep on when they were tired. As for power, wealth, and personal strength, these became a waste of life and were rejected by most elves. It was precisely because of this atmosphere of enjoying life and pursuing elegance that the pace of life of the elves seemed to be a little slow and lazy. Although there were several alarms on the west coast, most of the places that were attacked were at the edge of the coast. Hence, even if Tinshui City sent a large number of Pegasus Knights and Hippogriffs to patrol the coast, the elves in Quilling's Hut still seemed to be leisurely and enjoyed every day of their lives. As night fell, the number of people coming and going to Quilling's Hut gradually began to thin. Although the illusory forest was the home of the elves, when night fell, the fierce magical beasts would also come out to cause trouble. Therefore, there was no special need for it, and the elves didn't like to walk in the illusory forest at night. At the bottom of a low cliff 3 miles away from Quilling's Hut, a black-robed Bliss was discussing something with Mary in a low voice. After 5 days of traveling by night, the Bug-Lich Bliss finally succeeded in leading the bug army to the vicinity of Quilling's Hut. At this point, it would be up to the Blood Queen Mary to decide what to do next. Therefore, after both sides met here, everyone kept their mouths shut and silently listened to the instructions of the old fox, Venlier. This is an important elven territory near Skywater City. It would be wishful thinking for us to encircle and clean up the elves as we did in the past. Once they stayed here for too long, the distance of 200 li was nothing to the Tinshui City guards. So whether we win or lose, we have to fight fast. We can't take more than 5 hours to attack the Quellin's Hut. 5 hours is too short. This way, even if the operation to kill the elves is successful, there won't be much time to clear out the resources inside. Bliss said with a gloomy expression. Lord Bliss, don't forget that we're still in danger. Once his position was exposed, it would be very difficult to get rid of them and escape to the edge of the coast. That's why we can't stay here for long. 5 hours is enough for us to run away from the elven guards in the town and plunder as much as we can. Mary stood at the side with a straight face. She did not pay much attention to the negotiation between Venlier and Bliss. She looked towards the northeast and frowned. She felt an indescribable pressure pressing down on her, making it hard for her to breathe. Had they been exposed in this operation? Or would there be a change in the operation later? Or is there some big shot nearby? For a moment, too many possibilities flooded her mind, making it hard for her to calm down. No need to argue, Mary said decisively. We only have 4 hours. Once the 4 hours are up, we'll disband immediately no matter how we fight. If you're not afraid of death, you can stay and continue sweeping. All the loot will be yours. I don't want to share. Bliss did not dare to be stubborn in front of Mary, and nodded silently in agreement. Since time was tight, there was no need to set up slowly and surround them before attacking. After the few of them came to a decision, they immediately split up and started moving. Bliss's insect army was always by his side. He walked into the forest, raised his hands, and shouted in a low voice, "Come out, my people." As soon as Bliss's voice fell, the clearing in the forest with a radius of 100 meters immediately boiled up. The black soil rose up like waves, and as the soil at the top of the mounds cracked and crumbled, large swarms of black beetles spewed out from within, instantly turning the place into a terrifying sea of insects. Bliss's black body collapsed in an instant, dispersing into hundreds and thousands of black beetles that merged into the swarm of insects, forming a terrifying torrent that surged towards Quellen's hut not far away. Behind the swarm of insects, a large swarm of vampire bats began to advance under the cover of the lush treetops. Under the dim moonlight, a terrifying scene was about to unfold in the forest. Warren was just an ordinary elven archer. He was honored to be selected into the garrison of Quellen's hut, becoming a trainee elven warrior. His daily mission was to guard the outpost at the edge of the town, to prevent wild beasts and magical beasts from entering the town at night. The work of a night watch was actually very boring, if not for the clever and adorable cat head, accompanying him and chattering with him. Quellen might not have been able to withstand the long and lonely night. The cat head was an owl that grew up with him and could be considered an animal companion that accompanied him day and night. However, there was clearly something unusual today. Once it was dark, the cat head seemed a little anxious and nervous, flying into the forest from time to time and circling around as if searching for something. But in the dark and dense forest, it almost always returned empty-handed. Just as the bright moon hung in the sky, this usually calm and composed animal companion seemed to be possessed as it continuously circled around the sentry post. Then, it quickly pounced on Hua Lin's shoulder and neighed loudly. "Enemy! Danger!" After a quick exchange, Hua Lin only managed to get some simple information from the cat head. He was not like those druids who could use nature spells to directly communicate with animals. Hua Lin was able to get this information because of his familiarity and understanding with the cat head. There's an enemy approaching the outpost. Hua Lin quickly carried his longbow on his back, put on his quiver, and slung on his short sword. With both hands holding onto a tree vine, he leaped up the tall tree next to him as light as a monkey. After finding a hidden place, Hualun used the dense leaves to cover his body. He drew his bow and arrow, holding his breath as he scanned the forest under the night sky with rapt attention. As a probationary member of the garrison, he would be reprimanded by his superior if he randomly sent out a warning without discovering the enemy's presence. Therefore, Hualun could only silently observe the movements around him. When he calmed down and completely immersed his mind into the night wind, other than the rustling sound of the leaves in the forest, he could faintly hear some strange sounds. Chirp, chirp, chirp. It was like the sound of insects gnawing on dead wood, and also the sound of insects rubbing against their shells. But with such a dense sound, could it be that the little insects nearby were all rioting? Just as he was inexplicably surprised, Hualun finally noticed something wrong. The earth was moving under his careful observation. The black earth in the distance seemed to be wriggling, like a wave silently rushing over. The chirping sound was getting louder and louder. The dark night could not obstruct Hua Luin's sharp vision, and his expression finally changed drastically. This was not the earth surging, but it was a swarm of innumerable black beetles advancing. Like a black ocean, the swarm of insects flooded the forest, crossed the hills, crossed the stream, and were advancing at a crazy speed towards the Quilling's hut. Beep! The piercing sound of a police siren finally sounded. The arrow in Hua Luan's hand shot out with a bang and instantly sank into the black sea of insects. He did not know if he had shot any insects dead, but Hualun quickly drew his bow and arrow, preparing for a second attack. At this moment, a strange flapping sound of wings in the dense forest reached his ears. Hualun looked up in shock, and what he saw was a furry mouth that was rapidly expanding. The moment the piercing siren sounded, in the middle of the bustling Quilling's hut, a graceful and vigorous female elf walked out of the tree hall and looked in the direction of the siren. Almost at the same time, the deputy captain of the garrison team, Aaron, held her quiver and ran to the female elf, panting. "It seems to be a siren coming from the southwest. Have you sent anyone to check?" This shrewd and capable female elf was the captain of the town's garrison team, and she quickly asked when she saw the deputy captain rushing back. As the chief military officer of the town, she was not as ignorant as ordinary elves. Recently, the border of the West Coast had not been very peaceful. If it was really a siren coming from the southwest, then the problem could become very serious. "I've already sent someone. Hualun is on sentry duty in the west tonight, and, judging from the sound, it seems to be a siren from the west sentry. Do you think we should inform all the members of the garrison team to gather?" "Gather!" The female elf captain was still looking into the distance. "I have a feeling that something bad might happen tonight." However, before the deputy captain could ring the bronze bell in the center of the village, the southwest had already become chaotic. This uproar was not limited to a single area, but a general one. It was visible to the naked eye that the southwest edge of the Quilling's hut was blown by a gust of cold wind, and everywhere it went, it immediately became chaotic. Many elves stretched their necks and roared, quickly running away while climbing up to higher ground. It seemed that some terrifying beast had rushed into the town. "Immediately gather people. I'll rush over to take a look." Chapter 665. At this moment, the outskirts of the town were in complete chaos. The black insects were like terrifying beasts that devoured everything. Any elves that fell into the swarm would be instantly covered by the insects and drowned into a constantly struggling pile of insects. What was even more terrifying was that none of the elven villages and towns seemed to have any defensive measures, such as walls or walls. Apart from being used to limit the elves' range of activities, the sparse fences did not have the slightest protection or defensive effect. If the elves could build tall and sturdy walls like the humans, they might be able to temporarily delay the advance of the insects. But now, the unprotected elven town became the target of the black insect seas, rampantly spreading and devouring. Many elves who lived at the edge of the town were forced up the tall trees by the swarm of insects. However, before they could calm down and take a few breaths, streaks of black insect shadows and a dark red cloud drowned out their position. There was no lack of outstanding combat ability among these elves. In the face of the swarm of demonic mantises and vampire bats, they had no space to dodge or escape. They could only desperately exchange blows with the other party. Unfortunately, be it the demonic mantises or vampire bats, they never cared about casualties. Hence, in this chaotic battle, the elven warriors with outstanding sword skills and the archers with unparalleled accuracy did not even have the time to display 1% of their strength before they were pounced down the tall trees by the demonic mantises. At the edge of the elven town, a black torrent swept in. The elven warriors who encountered had just unleashed their combat aura of different colors when they were completely drowned by the swarm of insects. Only the elven archers leaped high and low between the tall trees, occasionally shooting a few rays of intense cold light into the sea of insects. Unfortunately, these fellows could not hold on for long before they were annihilated one by the hordes of demonized, praying mantises. The entire edge of the town was in complete chaos. When the female elf captain rushed to the scene, she happened to meet the elves who were retreating in defeat. Only 3 to 5 minutes of battle had already made these elves feel as if they had gone through a long period of torment. All of their faces were deathly pale, and they were still in a state of shock. Aside from fear, there was nothing else in their eyes. No matter how one looked at it, the female elf captain possessed the strength of a Tier 2 basic elf. Seeing that the situation was dire, she grabbed a vine and gently swung herself up a tall tree. She then pulled out 3 elven feather arrows decorated with strange magical patterns from her quiver. Twang, twang, twang. 3 enchanted exploding arrows shot into the sea of black insects in a triangular formation. In the next second, the violent shockwave from the explosion spread out and quickly engulfed the entire front line of the black sea of insects. The speed at which the black sea of insects charged forward immediately slowed down. Visible to the naked eye, 3 visible defects appeared at the front of the sea of insects. Against such a dense sea of insects, the ordinary elven arrows had already lost their miraculous effect of defeating the enemy. Instead, the simple and crude exploding arrows were more effective in dealing group damage. However, when the female elf captain reached into the quiver again, the number of arrows she felt with her fingertips made her frown. There were still 30 ordinary elven feather arrows, but only 2 enchanted exploding arrows. Such powerful enchanted arrows could only be refined by the few elven mages in the Elven Kingdom. Hence, a garrison captain like her only carried 5 enchanted arrows with her. Once they were used up, it would be too late to return to the tree hall to replenish them. As Quellen's hut was an elven town, there were only 30 enchanted arrows stored in the warehouse. Facing the situation today, it was simply not enough. Just as the female elf captain was hesitating, a black humanoid figure quickly rose from the black sea of insects at the corner of the street. After the insect, Lich Bliss, condensed his body with the swarm of insects, he secretly peeked at the Tier 2 divine archer through the gaps between the branches. The other party was a Tier 2 divine archer, far beyond what he could kill. According to their previous agreement, the insect Lich Bliss mission was to control the swarm of insects to break through the defenses of the elven town and trap the elves in the sea of insects. As for the elves above Tier 2, they were all handed over to the vampires led by Mary to deal with. Hence, after seeing the Tier 2 divine archer, Bliss did not reveal himself rashly, instead waiting silently. Under his silent command, the black sea of insects paid no heed to the damage caused by the magic exploding arrows. They only slowed down for a moment before swarming forward once more. Meanwhile, the demonized mantises turned into streaks of black shadows, bypassing the Tier 2 divine archer and pouncing towards the center of the town. Faced with this situation, the female elf captain, who could see the entire situation, became increasingly anxious and furious. She moved like lightning, quickly flashing between the tall, ancient trees. The elven feather arrows in her hands were like streaks of magical lightning, chasing after the demonized mantises from behind. One of the demonized mantises could not dodge in time, and was actually pierced through the chest by an elven feather arrow, nailing it to a thick branch. With the vitality of the demonized mantises, such a small injury was not enough to kill them. The demonized mantis struggled with all its might, pulling the elven feather arrow out of its body bit by bit. At this moment, the female elf captain had already caught up to it, showering it with elven feather arrows. In the blink of an eye, the triangular head, chest, and the bulging abdominal sac of the demonized mantis were pierced by the elven feather arrow. It struggled with all its might for a moment, and finally died from its severe injuries. Making use of this short period of time, the remaining demonized mantises charged towards the tree hall in the center of the town without looking back, not caring about the casualties of their companions. The female elf captain's expression changed slightly. She lowered her body slightly, intending to rush back to rescue the mantises. But at this moment, a series of shrill cries sounded behind her. The enemy that could truly threaten her had finally appeared. Standing at the top of the tall tree, Under the illumination of the cold moonlight, the female elf captain looked around and saw a few strange figures surrounding her. 3 human knights clad in strange blood-colored armor appeared in the north, south, east, and west. Each of them was strong and vigorous, with cold and sinister expressions. The scarlet cloaks on their backs fluttered in the night wind. Although their appearances were almost identical to humans, the female elf captain knew very well that they were not humans at all. That was because she had seen very clearly that these people were all transformed from some strange giant bats. The female elf captain slowly turned around, facing the beautiful and enchanting woman who descended from the sky with her gray bat wings gently flapping behind her back. The female elf captain was in a daze for some reason. She never knew that there would be a woman who could look so enchanting and enchanting. Looking at the other party's exquisite and beautiful face, looking at the other party's fiery curves, looking at the other party's strange appearance that was neither human nor monster, and looking at the other party's scarlet eyes. The female elf captain had to admit that such a woman was terrifyingly beautiful even in her own eyes. Her beauty was heartbreaking. Enchantment? After a moment of absent-mindedness, the female elf captain quickly regained her senses. This time, she finally saw through the other party's beautiful appearance. Tier 2. The other party was also a Tier 2? No. After looking around, the female elite leader was shocked to discover that the few female witches surrounding her were all Grade 2 witches. There was nothing to talk about between elves and witches. Thus, both sides only paused for a moment before charging at each other without hesitation. As if realizing that Mary was the leader of the group, the female elf captain didn't care about the attacks from the 3 blood knights at all. Instead, she focused all her firepower on the beautiful, which who had a natural enchantment. Both sides fought with speed, like a horse lantern under the moonlight, moving quickly through the forest. Because their figures were too fast, from afar, the entire forest was filled with illusory figures that were left behind by their flashes. The crisp sound of metal clashing also spread far and wide in the forest. As a Tier 2 elven archer, the female elf captain not only had enchanted explosive arrows, but also many other archery skills such as magic arrows, guided arrows, and arrow rain. While dodging and moving, the female elf captain's elven longbow vibrated continuously, sending arrows into the parts where the blood knight's armor couldn't reach. Unfortunately, after wasting nearly half of the arrows, the female elf captain was shocked to find that the other party was simply a group of immortal monsters. Even if an arrow pierced through their brains or slit their throats, these monsters would still fight with vigor. They pulled out the arrows, broke them, and threw them to the side. The bloody holes left by the arrows slowly healed under the layers of bloody aura until they were as good as new. Damn it, these monsters don't have any weaknesses. How could she kill them? However, at this moment, in the tree hall in the center of the town, a huge magical firework soared into the sky and exploded into a gorgeous firefly. Looking from afar, 2 hippogriffs could be seen quickly rushing up, carrying the elven archers on their backs and flying towards the distant sky water city. The Quellen's hut had finally sent out a distress signal. At this time, only half an hour had passed since the attack on the Quellen's hut. However, this half an hour was already like a year for the elves. Taking advantage of the time when the 3 blood knights were entangled with the female elf captain, Mary suddenly turned into a red blood mist and rushed to the side of the enemy, engulfing it. Both sides were entangled in the thick blood mist. With a few angry shouts and the sound of bowstrings, 2 huge balls of fire exploded in the blood mist. A moment later, Mary flapped her bat wings and slowly rose into the sky. She held the female elf captain's waist with one hand and held her head with the other, lying on her neck and sucking on it. The 2 huge bloody holes on Mary's shoulder and right thigh quickly healed under the lingering bloody aura. As long as Mary was patient, it wouldn't be a problem to take down the female elf without any losses. However, being in enemy territory, a long night was fraught with trouble. So, Mary showed an opening and provoked the enemy to use the 2 remaining enchanted explosive arrows to deal with her. In this way, taking advantage of the gap when the enemy was focused and shooting, Mary successfully broke through the enemy's side and captured her. While Mary sucked the sweet blood out of the other party's body with all her might, she also silently returned a trace of her origin blood. Under Mary's strong control, this trace of blood source slowly seeped into the enemy's brain through the enemy's blood circulation system. There, the origin blood slowly mutated into an indiscernible cocoon of blood, trapping a part of the brain inside. Chapter 666. The production of faith energy was very strange, and the existence of faith was even more elusive. Due to years of opposing the gods, there was no lack of strange wizards who studied the gods. Through meticulous and comprehensive experiments, they had a preliminary understanding of the communication method between the believers of the gods and the gods. They discovered that everything seemed to be related to a brain node called the faith channel. When a normal living being became a believer of the gods, their god would leave a strange mark in their soul. This mark was like a magical switch. As long as the believer was in a pious state of prayer, it could establish a small but stable spiritual channel between the believer and the god, completing the transfer of faith energy. Of course, this faith channel worked both ways. When a believer opened their heart, their body, mind, and everything in their soul would be revealed to the god. However, the gods had no interest in understanding and exploring the thoughts and secrets of normal living beings. Through a large number of experiments and research, wizards discovered that as long as they could find a way to seal off a part of the brain of a believer of the gods and cut off the link between them and the god, they would only need to use a bewitching spell to trick a believer into changing their faith. However, this method of sealing off a part of the brain was also a test of the wizard's ability. If the sealed area was slightly off, the intelligence and thinking ability of the target would be greatly damaged. Even if the sealing was successful, the person would still become an idiot. The location of the sealed area in the brain and the appropriate size of the area varied from person to person, so one could only slowly explore and experiment. Of course, Mary did not have such high-level knowledge, nor did she have such exquisite witchcraft methods. Hence, when she had attempted to embrace a Tier 2 female elf, she had relied on the vampire race's special ability to do so. In previous experiments, she had accidentally transformed some high-grade elves into blood elves. Unfortunately, this female elf leader was destined to make her return without any success. It was unknown whether it was because her mental strength was especially tenacious or because her faith was especially devout. In short, when Mary's embrace was in progress and the blood cocoon was about to perfectly cover the path node, the female elf's soul undulations suddenly erupted with a wave. The ripple was very weak, and it was completely sealed by the blood cocoon in the blink of an eye. However, it had unknowingly alerted a strange existence tens of thousands of miles away. Silsa, who was whispering with Goddess Miwei in the Moonlight Shrine, suddenly stopped talking and silently turned her head to look and sense somewhere in the southwest. "Sister Sylvia, what's wrong?" Miwei asked in confusion. After a moment of hesitation, a hint of anger appeared on her face. "Just now, a high-ranked believer and I lost our connection," Yi Zichen said. She spoke very casually and vaguely. If it were any other mortal, they might not even be able to understand the meaning behind it. However, the person in front of her was none other than the elven goddess of Moonlight Mivi, who was also an elven goddess. She immediately grasped the key points in Sylvia's words. High-level worshippers, their information channels have been severed. As long as an elf chose to believe in a certain god, the god would be able to smoothly leave a special mark on the elf soul with the help of some sacred prayer rituals. Many believers who were loved and cared for by the gods could even manifest this brand and turn it into an extremely eye-catching divine mark. Anyone who possessed a divine mark would have a god watching over him or her. In the system of divine spell practitioners, even the divine messengers could not manifest a mark. Only the more favored and favored sons and daughters could have it. There were only two ways to erase the mark of a god spirit once it was branded. One was the death of the believer, and the other was the conversion of the believer. However, these two possibilities were almost rare on the Kalan continent. Let's talk about conversion first. It was almost impossible for a forest elf to completely abandon her faith in the elven goddess Silsa and change her faith to another goddess. This was almost impossible in Kalan continent. Even the messengers of the goddess of moonlight, Miwe, had to maintain a shallow faith in Sylvia while madly believing in Miwe. This was almost an unwritten rule of the elven gods. No one, not even a god, dared to touch this rule. So it was impossible for a believer to convert. Then the only possibility left was the death of the believer. But even if the high-ranking believer really died, the divine mark should have directly collapsed, and not broken, as Sylvia said. Didn't this mean that the faith node still existed, but Sylvia could no longer communicate with the believer through the faith node? No god could tolerate such a thing. So Sylvia closed her eyes and carefully checked, and finally, she could not hide the shock on her face. Unknowingly, the same situation had happened to 27 faith nodes one after another. It was just that when this happened before, Sylvia's body was high up in the divine kingdom, and it was difficult for her to clearly see through this abnormality through the plane barrier. Although the gods were omnipotent, they were not omniscient and omnipotent. For the believers they paid attention to, the gods could naturally observe everything that happened to them immediately. But for tens of millions of ordinary believers, only when they came to the temple or altar and prayed to the gods devoutly would the gods pay attention to them for a moment. Of course, this also required them to be able to do something that attracted the gods' interest and was worthy of the gods' attention. Otherwise, even the most diligent god would not be interested in the thoughts of an ant, no, a lamb. But it was in this darkness that Sylvia was shocked to find that her 27 believers, no, 28, had inexplicably lost connection with her faith. And Sylvia was abnormally sure that they were not dead. Fortunately, she had left the divine will behind when her believers were tortured to death. Otherwise, this kind of theft of believers might have lasted for a long time before she found out. So Sylvia nodded at me without hesitation and turned around to return to her main temple. Here, with the enormous power of faith that had been gathered on the giant god statue for thousands of years, Sylvia could more effectively use the power of her divine will. With such a perception, Sylvia was instantly enraged. Near an elven city called Sky Water City on the west coast of the Kalan continent, a large number of believers had died. Sensing the disappearing faith nodes one after another, Sylvia went completely berserk. She didn't need to shout or make any gestures. With just a thought, the main temple of the elven goddess immediately bloomed with dazzling holy light. From afar, the main temple seemed to be plated with a layer of golden light, which was especially holy and beautiful. In the area of the temple, all the elves who witnessed this scene couldn't help but kneel on the ground, devoutly chanting songs of praise for the elven goddess Sylvia. Only Sylvia's temple priests sensed the abnormality in this layer of golden light. They hurried to the main temple and knelt in front of the towering statue of the goddess. Skywater City, elven believers were slaughtered in the face of Sylvia's divine decree. The few temple priests looked at each other in dismay. Since ancient times, Sylvia had never given such a clear divine decree regarding the defense of a single place. And vaguely, the few temple priests could feel the anger of the goddess from Sylvia's cold and stern tone. Without the slightest hesitation, the few temple priests rushed out of the temple and ran to contact the high-ranking believers far away in Skywater City. Although they had vast and powerful divine power, they couldn't do anything in the face of a massacre that happened tens of thousands of miles away. The only thing they could do was to inform the elven guards in Skywater City and the high-grade believers in the vicinity of this news, so that they could become the goddess's envoys of vengeance and kill all the evil people who angered the goddess. Unfortunately, of the 4 messengers of the elven goddess, 2 were at the front line of the south coast, One was stationed in the Fane continent, and one was guarding the Elven Queen. None of them could be mobilized easily. Therefore, the few priests of the Divine Temple could only get in touch with the local priests through the altars of the Divine Temple and think of ways to recruit powerful high-grade believers. However, after a round of crazy wrangling and quarreling, they really found the most suitable target. Aijaya, the Spear of Vengeance. She was a female elven warrior who could advance to the Spear of Vengeance profession, which was rare in the Elven Kingdom. In everyone's mind, elven women were always soft and weak. Although they weren't too weak to be blown away by a gust of wind, they were more delicate compared to the females of other races, giving people a strange feeling that they would break at the slightest touch. As a female elf, this Spear of Vengeance, Aijaya, didn't have the delicate characteristics of ordinary female elves. Instead, she gave people a sense of masculinity and toughness. She wasn't ugly, and it was impossible for her to be ugly. However, the way she dressed was very different from that of ordinary female elves. Instead, she had the wild and tough temperament of an Amazon. She wore a hollowed-out black leather armor and sweat-soaked belts. That was all she had on. There were no earrings or pendants, no necklaces or headbands, no bracelets or flowers. In short, she didn't like anything that elven women liked. She dressed like a female Amazon warrior and carried her beloved spear wherever she went. Chapter 667. She who defied the mainstream development path of the elves and had muscles comparable to male elves unexpectedly leaped to level 3 in one fell swoop. At that time, it caused quite a stir in the elf kingdom. The elves had a deep-rooted problem of judging people by their appearance. Even though Aijaya, the Spear of Vengeance, had the strength of level 3, most elves still couldn't recognize her bravery and valiance. After all, according to the tradition of the forest elves, elegant speech, noble temperament, and beautiful appearance were the criteria to judge an elf status. As for the methods and combat strength of bloody battles, the forest elves who had lived in peace for a long time didn't think that it was necessary for them to continue their happy lives. Therefore, even with Aijaya's strength and prestige, she was still excluded from the mainstream society by the high elves of the elf kingdom. However, when Silsa's subordinates heard that Aijaya, the Spear of Vengeance, was near Skywater City, they were overjoyed. Under their strong push, a mission was quickly issued in the name of the main temple of the god of elves. The battle in Quellen's house was still ongoing. Compared to the ferocious sea of insects, the elves' resistance was slightly weaker. Due to the lack of strong fortresses and insurmountable natural barriers, the wide and flat forest paths, tree bridges, and crisscrossing rattan ropes in this elf town became a broad path for the insects to pass through. The elves' activity space was getting smaller and smaller. Most of the elves were even forced to the treetops and relied on the dense cobweb-like rattan ropes and tree bridges to move quickly on the tall ancient trees. However, at this moment, the swift demonic mantises with a series of phantoms behind them became more and more terrifying. They were like vicious wolves lurking outside a flock of sheep, rapidly approaching the elves who were struggling to resist under the cover of the dense treetops. Once they seized the opportunity to pounce, their lightning-fast flying speed and sharp sickle forelimbs that were comparable to magic weapons almost completely suppressed the elven sword dancers and archers. While the forest elves were still running on the treetops, the mantises madly caught up to them and chopped off the treetops one by one. The elves who fell off the treetops didn't have the chance to stand up again before they were overturned by the swarm of insects. Even if they resisted with all their might, it was difficult for them to escape the tragic fate of being bitten by thousands of insects. Blitz, who was hidden in the sea of insects, didn't seem to care about the casualties of the elves. He used the insects as cover to devour many elven warriors. As for the ordinary elves, they were dragged underground after being bitten to death. Their white eggs were stuffed into their bodies. Many of the elves' corpses were already swollen like rubber balls. With the nourishment of the elves' flesh and blood, every time an egg exploded, dozens to hundreds of black larvae would crawl out of it. These black larvae fed on flesh and blood, maturing and growing at a speed visible to the naked eye. When the sticky liquid on the surface of their bodies solidified into a tough shell that could not be damaged by blades, they would crawl out of the ground and join the mighty swarm of insects. It was precisely by relying on this method of instant reproduction and instant maturation that not only did the boundless black sea of insects not shrink after the battle began, they even showed signs of flourishing. Other than having sharp fangs and limbs, the insect swarms in the past did not have any powerful abilities or means. But now, as the insect Lich Blitz's strength increased, the insect swarms had also evolved some strange abilities. The current insect, Lich Blitz, was only at grade 1, and the only ability he could bestow upon the insect swarms was Burrow. Such a large insect army was able to hide from the elven patrols and flying scouts, sneaking all the way to this Quillen's hut because of the insect swarm's ability to burrow. One could imagine that as Blitz's abilities improved, the insect swarms would also gain new combat abilities. If the insect swarms were soldiers under Blitz's control and command, then the demonized mantises were the generals and heroes of Swarm. Although they were few in number, each of them possessed powerful combat abilities that far surpassed ordinary insects. Just the current demonized mantises alone had many strange abilities such as burrowing, flying at top speed, flickering shadows, killing ferociously, and confinement spells. They were like assassins hidden in the insect swarms. Once they reached the enemy's side, it would be extremely difficult for the enemy to escape unscathed. The strange confinement spell was like an invisible shackle. As long as the demonized mantises' side-like forelimbs were stained with the enemy's blood, the enemy would never be able to escape. The only way to escape was to kill these demonized mantises. In fact, if one were to compare the number of Grade 1 warriors between the insect swarms and the elven guards, the guards of Quillen's hut would definitely be able to defeat the less than 30 demonized mantises. But under the relentless onslaught of the insect swarms, the elves simply could not defend themselves, let alone form a formation to resist the demonized mantises. One by one, the elven swordsmen and elven archers were scattered by the insect swarms, and could only escape in 2s and 3s using the trees. With such a loose team, once they encountered a swarm of demonized mantises, they naturally had no chance to retaliate or resist. As long as the demonized mantises were forced off the trees, the swarm of insects would naturally devour any opponent. In such a one-sided battle, the demonized mantises would occasionally face the elves' courageous counterattacks. From the beginning of the battle until now, 3 demonized mantises had died on the battlefield, but the elves had already lost over 100 Grade 1 warriors. As for the elven powerhouses who performed exceptionally well, as long as they showed themselves on the battlefield, Mary and a group of Blood Knights would take advantage of the situation and kill them. No matter how strong the elven powerhouses were individually, as long as they had not reached the invincible Grade 3 level, they would not be able to withstand the encirclement of multiple Grade 2 vampires. Apart from Mary and the 3 Blood Knights, there was another group of blood elves with strange abilities in the red cloud floating above the forest. There were only 17 blood elves, and only 3 of them were Grade 2. The new Grade 2 blood elf was the female elf leader that Mary had just embraced. At this moment, there were not many changes to her body, appearance, and weapons. The only obvious change was that her eyes were blood red. This female elf, who had previously fought bravely for the forest elves without a care for her own safety, had now transformed into a cold and ruthless blood elf archer. The arrows that were imbued with blood-red energy streaked across the sky, and with every arrow, an elf would fall from the trees with a shrill cry. Among the 3 Grade 2 blood elves that the Blood Queen Mary had embraced, there were 2 sharpshooters, and the remaining one was a weapons master. Now that they had the ability to suck blood, their attacks became more and more unbridled. If it was said that when they were still forest elves, their abilities were only suitable for combat. But now that they had become blood elves, they had been modified to be completely suitable for killing. Fighting and killing sounded similar, and there was not much difference. But on a bloody battlefield where life and death could be decided in the blink of an eye, the difference between them would be the difference between life and death. Every move of the elves pursued beauty and elegance, and they could not do vicious moves such as using their comrades to block a knife, rolling on the ground, or exchanging injury for injury. On the other hand, these modified blood elves would charge to the side of their opponents at the slightest provocation. Even if they were to suffer more injuries, they would still exchange injury for injury. They did not even care when their opponent's swords cut their exquisite and perfect faces. And this was precisely what the forest elves could not do. At this point in the battle, the forest elves were already showing signs of collapse. When the black sea of insects engulfed the entire elven town, the elven garrison, who had lost their geographical advantage, finally blew the horn to retreat. The vast, empty space in the forest was filled with black swarms of insects. The elves could only jump around on the tall, ancient trees, fleeing for their lives in the direction of the faraway sky water city. At the start, they were still grouped in twos and threes, covering each other's retreat. However, when the horde of demonized mantises launched a surprise attack, these loose troops were instantly torn apart. The elves could only give up on the thought of resisting, turning around and fleeing frantically. On the tall, ancient trees, the black figures of the demonic mantises were like terrifying death gods roaming the battlefield. Wherever they went, the elves that were caught by them could only desperately counterattack and cause some damage to them. There was no way for them to escape. One by one, the slender figures were caught by them, and they quickly fell to the ground. What was left was an indescribably tragic scene that repeated itself again and again. With the demonic mantises around, there were very few elves that could escape from the Quilling's hut. However, the three tree warriors that were the guardians of the elven town had also brought extremely terrifying casualties to the insect army. Whether it was the insect swarm or the vampire swarm, they did not have powerful long-range attacks. Thus, when faced with the thick-skinned tree warriors, they could not think of any other way to deal with them other than using the swarm of insects to drown them. In the end, the insect army commanded by the insect Lich Bliss cut down the 3 death warriors that were left behind at the cost of 50,000 casualties. It only took an hour and a half for the insect demon allied army, led by Mary and Bliss, to defeat the elven garrison. Then, they spent another hour chasing and killing the 3 tree warriors. By the time they returned to the Quilling's hut, a full 3 hours had passed. Thus, there was only an hour left for them to collect the spoils of war and plunder the elves' resources. Chapter 668. Aijaya sprinted swiftly under the bright and cold moonlight. Ancient trees that were dozens of meters tall passed by her feet as if they were flat ground. Cliffs and streams were left behind in the blink of an eye. The damp night wind blew against her face, wetting her leather armor and cheeks, but it couldn't extinguish the anger in her heart. After hearing the news of the attack on Quilling's hut from Hippogriphon Archer, Aijia didn't wait for the arrival of the envoy from the elf shrine and set off on her journey alone. Before she set off, the guards of Tinshui City were still trying to gather. Since the enemy dared to invade Quilling's hut, which was less than 200 kilometers away from Tinshui City, it either meant that they were powerful and weren't afraid of the counterattack of Tinshui City's guards, or it was a conspiracy to divert the guards of Tinshui City. Therefore, the elf commander of Tinshui City and some high elves quarreled in the conference hall over the scale of the troops to be dispatched. Just like the extravagant nobles in human society, there was also a special class in the elf kingdom, the high elves. The so-called high elves were still forest elves, but their bloodline was more ancient and longer. They were proud of this and believed that only high elves were the purest and noblest forest elves. They refused to marry commoners and tried their best to protect the so-called bloodline from being polluted by the outside world. They had great power, and most of the elders and counselors in the elf kingdom could only be taken up by high elves. In Tinshui City, although the elf commander had absolute command over the troops, he couldn't completely ignore the protests of the high elves and nobles. As soon as he received the news of the attack on Quilling's hut, the elf commander planned to send all the air forces to support the Quilling's hut and the ground forces to the minimum. Unfortunately, due to the high elves' protests, the types and numbers of troops dispatched were reduced. Unable to bear the heartless and cold-blooded procrastination, the hot-tempered AI angrily chose to go alone. There were about 5 or 6 powerful elves who made the same decision. They were all rogues who had the strength of grade 2 or 3 and weren't willing to be restrained by the army. It was a pity that their speed and stamina couldn't compare to AI Jaya's sturdy physique. Therefore, they were soon left far behind by the vengeance spear. Walking in the forest under the pure and beautiful moonlight was a kind of heroic and passionate feeling. If AI Jaya wasn't worried about her clansmen, she would have thrown her head back and roared at the sky, looking for a powerful demonic beast to fight. AI Jaya, the spear of vengeance, might not be famous among the elves, but among the magical beasts in the Central Mountain Range, she was known as the Mad Woman. Whether it was the powerful twin-legged flying dragon king, the berserk giant ape with boundless strength, or the sly and cunning silver-tailed fox, they had all been harassed by her to the point where they wanted to cry, but had no tears. As for the other magical beasts, as long as they had a bit of reputation and prestige, she would come to challenge them. It could be said that AI Jaya, the spear of vengeance's terrifying combat skills, came from thousands of life and death challenges. The big and small wounds and scars all over her body were the best proof of her craziness and fighting spirit. Although the forest elves were the masters of the Sapphire Continent, it was still very dangerous to cross the magical forest under the moonlight. Every night, the wild beasts and vicious beasts that hid in the caves during the day would come out of their nests and search for fresh meat in the depths of the dark forest. Most of the wild beasts were affected by the force of nature and wouldn't attack the forest elves on their own initiative. However, some vicious beasts would attack the elves out of hunger or under the influence of tyranny. Therefore, under normal circumstances, the forest elves would abide by some unwritten rules and wouldn't approach or cross the territories of the vicious beasts at night. However, such rules were useless to AI Jaya. She even threw her head back and let out a long roar as she sprinted, taking the initiative to challenge the king of the magical beasts in the nearby forests. Unfortunately, the magical beasts were already familiar with her voice and aura. Therefore, not only would the roars of the magical beasts not respond to her, but the forest would also become quiet. All the magical beasts would temporarily stop hunting and hide in the deep bushes, hoping that this she-devil would leave their territory as soon as possible. Even with AI Jaya's physique, she was drenched in sweat after running for 200 kilometers in the forest. As she gradually approached Quellin's hut, she began to meet some elves who had escaped from there. From them, AI Jaya painfully heard some of the worst news. A towering fire had turned the former elf town into a terrifying field of raging flames. Before entering Quellin's hut, the heat waves and lingering flames were enough to force people to step back, not daring to get close to the fire. Several elves who had escaped from here fell to their knees at the edge of the fire in agony, crying bitterly and heartbroken. Beside them, AI Jaya walked into the fire resolutely with a purple aura around her body. Quellin's hut was a medium-sized elf town. The central area was made up of 20 to 30 large ancient trees, with crowns reaching up to 100 meters tall. The huge shade of the trees stretched as far as the eye could see. Unlike the straight and flat roads in human settlements, the elves' villages and cities rarely had any wide and flat roads. The elves' houses and buildings were built at the joints of the thick branches of the tall ancient trees, and they relied on tree bridges and wrought-tan ropes to get between them. But now, this beautiful and prosperous elf town had been burned to the ground by evil enemies. Every ancient tree within a radius of 3 kilometers was swallowed by the sea of fire, twisting and struggling in pain in the raging flames. Under the illumination of the towering flames, AI Jaya walked in the sea of fire with a solemn expression. She used her violent sacrifice warrior energy to force away the flames lingering around her, and her eyes flashed quickly, searching for the enemy. The enemy obviously hadn't gone far. Although the flames were fierce, AI Jaya saw large patches of black bloodstains on the tree trunks, ground, and branches. Around the tree warriors in the center of the town, AI Jaya saw black beetle carcasses that covered the entire forest. The tree warriors had obviously fought to the last moment of their lives. Beside their collapsed torsos, a thick layer of beetle carcasses almost covered half of their bodies. Their torsos were covered with countless large and small scars. And at the edge of this tragic battlefield, AI Jaya found a small pile of ashes. AI Jaya squatted beside the ashes, grabbed a handful of ashes with her right hand, and rubbed it. The ashes fluttered in the air as if they were weightless. It was a small pile of ashes that were almost completely burned out. AI Jaya couldn't help but narrow her eyes. In such a fierce fire, it wasn't unusual to see some ashes after burning. But to burn anything so thoroughly without leaving any bone residue or minerals behind was very strange. In AI Jaya's impression, only special spirits or undead creatures could cause such a strange phenomenon after death. Therefore, if her inference was correct, it could only mean that some powerful undead creatures had appeared in this team of witches. Undead creatures were evil, and so were witches. It wasn't that surprising that they were together. The only thing that surprised AI Jaya was how those hateful witches had produced such a large number of horrifying insects. If the number of insects was so huge, what method did they use to avoid the detection of the elf patrol team and the omnipresent sentinels in the air? While AI Jaya was still in shock, she suddenly turned her head and focused her hawk-like gaze on a place densely covered with small mounds and wormholes in the forest clearing. And there, the flames were especially concentrated there. It seemed that the witches who left were trying to cover up something with the fire. AI Jaya tiptoed and arrived at the clearing in the forest in the blink of an eye. As soon as she stepped on the ground, AI Jaya's expression changed slightly. There was a hole in the ground, and the sound of stepping on it was slightly different from the sound on the ground. Without hesitation, AI Jaya leaped high, and a spear instantly appeared in her hand from the leather bag on her back. She inhaled and circulated her strength in the air, and the violent purple sacrifice warrior energy quickly gathered on the spear. In the next second, a purple shadow that was hard to be seen by the naked eye crossed the distance of more than 10 meters and exploded in the center of the clearing. The violent and ferocious shockwave suffocated the sea of fire around the clearing, and the scorched land instantly collapsed into a huge pit. When the dust settled, a shocking scene appeared in the pit. AI Jaya, the spear of vengeance, was instantly filled with rage. At the bottom of the pit was a pile of flesh, blood, and bones, as well as a horrendous, pungent mucus. Among the debris were many white insect cocoon fragments and dying larvae that hadn't developed yet. Looking at the strangely shaped bones, AI Jaya could almost picture what they looked like when they were alive, and she could also imagine the tremendous pain they had suffered at that moment. Roaring angrily at the sky, AI Jaya kicked the ground with one foot and leaped into the air. The spear of vengeance in her hand flashed quickly, and a ring of explosions surrounded the deep pit. Under her intentional control, the shockwave of the explosions surged to the periphery, and in a flash, the center of the sea of fire in the town was cleared. The witches had set the fire here because they didn't want the elves to find out about their evil deeds, but they didn't expect AI Jaya to come so quickly and in such a hurry. AI Jaya forcibly extinguished the fire around the deep pit with her violent strength, then turned around and sprinted southwest of the town. The enemy hadn't gone far. Chapter 669. The dark forest was filled with a deathly silence, and only a strange rustling sound could be heard. As he led the insect army through the magic forest, the battle cries of fierce magical beasts and demonic mantises could be heard from time to time. The weaker beasts and birds had sensed the arrival of the insect army and had long avoided them. Only the brainless magical beast that lacked keen intuition would ignore the power of the insect army and brazenly charge out to defend their territory or nest. Unfortunately, they had come out, and they would stay forever. It seemed that Madame Mary was not optimistic about this hunt. After the battle ended, she hastily cleaned up the battlefield and left with the vampires. Although Blitz, who was left behind, had done his best, it still took him 1.5 hours to sweep through the elven town. Now, he had to command the insect army to sweep away more than 30 carefully selected elves and a large number of rare resources. It would be difficult for him to sneak around like he did when he came. Hence, Blitz had no choice but to march on the ground and scatter a large number of demonic mantises on the periphery to drive away the magical beasts and plants that did not have eyes. When the insect army quickly flowed past a half-meter deep and crystal-clear stream, Billis, who was standing on the shore, suddenly turned his head around and looked at the distant battlefield with blazing flames. The 30 miles of forest made it impossible for him to see everything in the distance, but the sudden energy wave made him frown. So fast, less than half an hour after he led the insect army away from the hut in Quillins, there was a trace of movement at the scene of the fire. No matter what, this was not a good thing. Running 30 miles in half an hour, and with the danger of the forest at night, it would be difficult for an ordinary person to track the whereabouts of the insect army. But the same thing happened to the elves, and Blitz was no longer so sure. Sensing the traces of the energy wave coming from afar, Blitz's expression became a little gloomy. He could still feel the aftermath of the energy explosion from 30 miles of forest and mountain road. It was imaginable how much anger was contained in that attack. From the analysis of the intensity of the energy, there was a 70% chance that it was at the pinnacle of Grade 2 and a 30% chance of Grade 3. No matter which one it was not something he could handle with his current strength. Without saying a word, Bugwitch Bliss gave a series of orders to every corner of the insect swarm. Thus, after crossing the stream, the large swarm of insects continued to move quickly. A group of a few thousand black beetles stopped and began to lie in ambush on this side of the shore. Blitz even left a demonic mantis behind, just in case. Before the swarm could even run 15 miles away, the ambushers left behind had already found their prey. Unfortunately, this prey was like a berserk beast. It instantly cleaned up the tail left behind by Blitz. The other black beetles died too quickly. Before they could completely rush out from their hiding places, they were met with energy spears that pierced through the air. Yes, it was an energy spear throw, not a physical spear throw. These energy spears were imbued with incomparably violent purple dough chi. Once they came into contact with an object, they would cause a terrifying energy explosion. That was why the valiant and vigorous female elf only needed to leap into the air and lightly vibrate the vengeance spear in her hand to release streaks of beautiful purple spear shadows that shot into the swarm of insects. The beetles that Bliss had catalyzed all had tough carapaces that could withstand a certain degree of physical damage. But against such a violent and ferocious Dochi energy attack, it was clearly a little lacking. Before the 1,000+ black beetles could completely surge out, they were annihilated by the energy spears that exploded one after another. With the help of the eyes of the demonic mantis hidden in the dense treetops, Bliss finally saw the true face of the enemy from a dozen miles away. A female elf. A muscular and lithe female elf that did not lose to a male, especially when she stood in the air and roared as she threw the spears with all her might. That domineering aura that assaulted his face made even Bliss shudder. But just as Bliss was spying on the enemy, the fierce female elf standing in the air suddenly swept her gaze across. An incomparably fierce and furious gaze fell on the body of the demonic mantis through the dense branches and leaves. Not good. Bliss immediately knew that something was amiss and hurriedly controlled the demonic mantis to dodge. But it was too late. Under his terrified gaze, a wooden spear with violent purple dough Chi crossed 100 meters of the forest and pierced through the demonic mantis chest, nailing it to a tree trunk. The violent do chi on the spear erupted in an instant, enveloping the space within 3 meters in a purple wave. The demonic mantis was obliterated. Meanwhile, the insect which Bliss, who was several kilometers away, staggered as the purple wave almost reached his main body through the spiritual connection. An enemy had actually killed a Tier 1 intermediate demonized mantis with a single hit. This horrifying reality caused Bliss hair to stand on end. Grade 3. Definitely a Grade 3. There was even a possibility that it was a Grade 4 powerhouse without hesitation. The insect army that was carrying the elven captives and supplies immediately moved. 23 demonic mantises charged into the midst of the elven captives, their sharp sickle forelimbs piercing through the thighs and abdomens of the elves one after another. All the elven captives abruptly fell to the ground, screaming and groaning in pain. For a moment, the dense forest was filled with the sounds of painful groans. However, while the demonic mantises were very vicious, strangely, none of the elves died on the spot. After inflicting enough wounds on the elven captives, the demonic mantises and the insect army abandoned all the elves and supplies, charging into the dark forest without looking back. 5 minutes later, Jia, the Spear of Vengeance, rushed into the forest with a purple halo around her. In the next second, the scene that entered her eyes startled her, and she stomped her foot in anger. What a cunning enemy! With the captives and spoils of war, the enemy wouldn't be able to run fast. If the enemy had chosen to kill all the elves, Jaya would have chased even more fiercely in her rage. Now, the enemy had left her with a ground full of heavily injured elves. If she didn't treat them quickly, some of them might bleed to death. But if she stayed to treat the injured, the enemy would naturally be able to sail away leisurely. Just as Jaya was gnashing her teeth in anger, wishing she could devour the enemy's flesh and blood, a crisp and resonant eagle cry suddenly came from the horizon. As a veteran elven powerhouse, Jaya's face lit up at the sound. It was a hippogriphon. Jaya shook her wrist, and a dazzling purple light pierced through the dense treetops and shot straight into the clouds. With this clear target as a guide, the rising and falling eagle cries rapidly drew closer to this place. A moment later, the ancient tree above them trembled slightly, and a few agile figures flew down from above. "It's Madame Jaya. We found Madame Jaya. The captives are here too. Everyone come down." A clamor sounded, and more forest elves leaped down from the trees. These elves were obviously from Sky Water City. Their strength might be average, but riding on their hippogriffs, they weren't much slower than Jaya. Their arrival had solved a big problem for Jaya. At the very least, she wouldn't have to do chores like treating and saving people anymore. "Leave some of you to treat the injured. The rest, follow me and kill those bastards." Jaya roared and soared into the treetops. There, on top of the luxuriant treetops, there were many 4-meter-long hippogriffs covered in hard horn feathers, lying quietly on the thick branches of the trees. When they saw Jaya approaching, all the hippogriffs shifted their bodies uneasily. Their hawk-like sharp gazes stared viciously at the rude intruder. Although the hippogriffs were tamed flying mounts, ordinary people couldn't ride them. The horned eagles were also very resistant to strangers that they were not familiar with. But time was of the essence, and Jaya didn't have the time to argue with these beasts. She snorted, purple fighting aura swirling around her body. In an instant, she used the powerful aura of a Grade 3 powerhouse to suppress these restless fellows. In a flash, she leaped onto the largest and sturdiest of the hippogriffs. Go! Under her cold pressure, even though the horned eagle was extremely unwilling, it could only stomp on the ground, its giant wings flapping the air with all its might. It only managed to barely soar into the air after expending a great deal of effort. Normally, hippogriffs would choose soft and lithe elven girls. Coupled with light leather armor and a bow and arrow, the hippogriffs were able to control their weight. Ai Jaya, the spear of vengeance, was a sturdy, barbaric fellow that could rival a man. Her body was covered in belts and leather pouches. She had arm blades, short knives, javelins, daggers, and all sorts of other melee weapons. Allowing such a large man, who was overweight and armed to the teeth, to ride on the horned eagle would be a disaster for the large bird. It flapped its wings in pain, trying its best to maintain its altitude and glide quickly in the night sky. Aija didn't care about the hippogriff's cries of protest. Her sharp eyes quickly scanned the dark, illusory forest below her. Suddenly, she tilted her head, as if she had heard a strange sound in the forest. She flicked the hippogriff's head with her javelin, and the hippogriffs immediately changed their course. As soon as they approached the rustling sound, Aija raised the javelin in her hand high up, instantly condensing a dazzling purple glow. With an angry roar, the javelin shot down like lightning, disappearing into the pitch-black, illusory forest. Die. Chapter 670. A game of cat and mouse was being played in the depths of the illusory magic forest. In a dark shrubbery, the black soil suddenly burst open, and a large swarm of black beetles surged out from within, gradually forming a strange humanoid shape. After the insect which Bliss appeared, he sensed the other bait from afar, and his expression immediately turned ugly. In order to avoid the pursuit of that powerful elf, he had already sent out 4 groups of decoy soldiers to escape to different areas. But now, he could only sense 2 of them. In other words, during the time he was trying his best to escape, 2 insect armies of more than 10,000 had been completely annihilated one after another. Along with the annihilation of these 2 groups of insect armies, there were also 6 demonized mantises. After all, the demonized mantises were his standard guards. If he didn't arrange for them to be part of the decoy soldiers, it would have been very difficult to fool the forest elves who treated the illusory magic forest as their home. Under the intimidation of that powerful elf, the insect which Bliss didn't dare to show himself. He could only frequently cut off his tail like a lizard, trying to lure the enemy away and escape. Unfortunately, the speed of the insect army moving underground was too slow. Even if the elves were led astray, they would quickly eliminate the decoy soldiers and find new information about the insect army. Those accomplices of the horned eagle archers usually didn't dare to appear in front of the demonized mantises. Now, they were swaggering through the air above the vast forest, using the whispering spell, plant communication, animal communication, and other strange skills to search for the whereabouts of the largest insect army. The illusory magic forest was the home of the forest elves after all. Here, they had too many ways and means to find traces of outsiders. Therefore, after being forced out of the ground, the insect which Bliss made up his mind. He split the remaining 120,000 insect army and 18 demonized mantises into 4 groups. They didn't travel underground anymore, but ran through the forest and ran in 4 different directions. At this time, the entire illusory magic forest was filled with large groups of insect armies running and hunting without restraint. The demonized mantises that followed the groups all used the plant invisibility ability to hide in the treetops. When the elf archers rode on their horned eagles and flew past the treetops, they would suddenly attack. Relying on this method, the hundreds of miles of illusory magic forest were filled with elven archers being ambushed and killed. Aija, the spear of vengeance, led an elite team of archers to put out the fire. Wherever large groups of insect armies or demonic mantises appeared, they would quickly rush there with the help of the hippogriffs. Be it the densely packed insect army or the cruel and cunning demonized mantises, they were all ants that could be destroyed with a wave of her hand in front of the spear of vengeance. Even if Blitz gathered all the demonic mantises to attack Aija, it would only make her slaughter a little easier. It would be difficult to deal any damage to her with such a small number. It was because of this that Blitz decided to disperse the formation of the demonized mantises, allowing them to fight on their own, avoiding the elves and powerhouses that were in groups and targeting the lone ones. Although this wouldn't stop the demonized mantises from being destroyed, it would at least distract them and slow down their destruction. After making such a huge sacrifice, the insect Lich Blitz led a 30,000-strong insect army and 6 demonized mantises to escape towards the southeast. During the escape, the insect army had been moving towards the edge of the west coast with all their might. Blitz was worried that his movements were already known by the elves, so he could only send 2 groups of soldiers in that direction while he led the army towards the southeast. Perhaps his diversion tactic worked, as a large number of hippogriffs were indeed confused by the complicated situation of the enemy and focused their main force on a few groups of soldiers. This gave Blitz enough time to escape. After retreating to a safe area with a group of elves, he suddenly launched an all-out counterattack. With the help of 6 demonized mantises and the 30,000-strong insect army, the insect Lich Blitz killed a dozen hippogriffs that were chasing after him, before escaping into the forest in the distance unwillingly. When the Spear of Vengeance, AI-Gia, heard the news and rushed to the scene, the strange insect army was long gone. The enraged AI-Gia immediately ordered the elves that followed her to return to Skywater City to report the situation and sent the nearby Elven City guards to stop them. As for herself, she continued on her journey alone, following the traces left behind by the insect army into the forest. This was a rocky wasteland adjacent to the coastline. On one side was the raging tides, and on the other was a sparse, low forest. The illusory forest had only extended to this point, and the tall, ancient trees were nowhere to be seen. The only greenery that could be seen on the rocky wasteland was the low shrubs and slippery moss. In an extremely secluded cave at the edge of the coastline, a large group of vampire bats were hanging upside down on the cold, damp cave wall, huddled together. 6 young men and women sat with their backs ramrod straight beside a fire pit that had been dug out. 3 of them wore blood-colored armor and had blood-colored longswords strapped to their waists. They were the 3 blood knights that had followed Mary for a long time: Soros, Winsol, and Jose. Sitting opposite them were the 3 grade 2 blood elves that Mary had just recruited: Bonnie, female, archer; Candace, female, archer; and Leo, male, weapon master. As for the grade 1 ones, they could only cower and hide in the periphery, not qualified to get close to these grade 2 powerhouses. As for the ruler of all the vampires, the Blood Queen Mary reclined on a stone platform with her eyes closed, while the old fox, Winsol, stood respectfully by her side. The faint sound of flapping wings could be heard. A vampire bat landed in a pile of rocks and looked around with its beady eyes for a long time. After making sure that no one was following it, it pushed aside a small pile of rocks and entered the cave. After a series of rapid and bizarre distortions and transformations, the vampire bat turned into a young man. He tiptoed to Venlier's side and whispered a few words into his ear. After reporting the information, the young man turned back into a vampire bat and exited the cave. He flapped his bat wings and flew towards the nearby forest. "What's wrong?" Mary asked without even opening her eyes. She rested her head on her hand and lay on the stone platform. "Master, the scouts that were set up in the periphery have returned. The number of patrols by the elves today is half compared to yesterday. What do you think?" Winsol hurriedly bowed. Mary hesitated and opened her eyes. "What about Bliss?" "Lord Bliss has already sent 3 requests for help." The old fox, Winsol, smiled bitterly. "The vengeful spear is hot on his heels. I heard that Lord Bliss's insect army has less than 20,000 left." After days of investigation, the vampires had already figured out the specific details of that powerful elf. "Do you think we should go and help him?" Mary narrowed her eyes. Her ruby-like crimson pupils flashed with a faint cold light. "Lord Bliss is also a combat wizard that the master of the family has put in a lot of effort to cultivate. If we let him die in the magic forest, it will be a great loss to the Crimson family's future development." Winsol still had a gentle smile on his face. "Then you mean rescue?" Mary smiled faintly. "Of course we will. Winslow also smiled. But if we go and help him directly, I'm afraid it won't help. It might even attract the attention of the vengeful spear. Then what do you think we should do? We can change the battlefield. The surroundings of Sky Water City have become a dangerous place. The elves have set up many traps there, waiting for us to fall into them. Instead of that, we should turn around and head north and let the flames of war spread. Mary listened carefully with her eyes narrowed. She did not respond. The old fox, Winslow, could only continue his analysis. First, we have to figure out what we are doing here. Our main mission in coming to the Callan continent this time is to help Lady Alice obtain the Scepter of Prophecy. In order to do that, we must mobilize the powerhouses and elite troops in the central mountain range of the Elven Kingdom. So far, the Elven Kingdom has only gathered a large number of elites and powerhouses near the south coast to prevent the Pale Witch from bringing people into the Callan continent. So, no matter how rampant we are here, they will not dare to mobilize troops and powerhouses from the south coast. The master of the family has been slaughtering elves on the southwest coast for a while to lure the elves out. When there is a gap in the central mountain range, the master of the family's infiltration plan can be carried out. When that time comes, what will you choose to do, master? Mary could not help but snort. She straightened her body on the stone platform. Of course I'm going to. The Central Mountain Range is full of powerhouses and oracles. If I don't go and help, how can a few of them succeed? The old fox, Winslow, sighed in his heart, but the smile on his face did not diminish. Then we should make more trouble. It's best if we can stir up the elves on the south coast and the Pale Witch into a fight. By then, the master of the family may face less pressure. He could see that his fierce-looking mistress was sincere to the master of the family. She did not care about the danger in the Central Mountain Range, nor did she care about the team of vampires that she had painstakingly gathered. She was willing to sacrifice herself. Winslow could not help but curse in his heart. However, with the bloodline shackles, he could not have any disloyalty. So, he could only pinch his nose and plan for Mary according to her wishes. After all, he was the one who designed the plan. No matter how the situation developed in the future, he could not let himself fall into a desperate situation. Chapter 671. Callan Continent, Greenwater City. As the largest elven city near the south coast of the Elven Kingdom, almost all the powerful servants and powerful flying forces of the entire elven race gathered here. Here, they had a unified name and title, Windrunner Force. This Windstalker army seemed to include all of the flying units of the Elven Kingdom, from low-level flower fairies to high-level green fairies, and then from low-level Pegasus Knights to high-level Silver Pegasus Knights. There were also groups of Hippogriff Archers, Chimera Demon Beasts, Windhawk raiding teams. The Witch Coalition had occupied the Echo Islands for so long, but it was difficult to set foot on the Callan continent because of the existence of this Windrunner force. However, the Windrunners were, after all, just Grade 1 and Grade 2. If they wanted to deter those high-level witches, they had to rely on the elven oracles sent by the major temples in the Central Mountain Range and the powerful elves recruited from all over the world. In Greenwater City, there were as many as 5 Grade 4 powerhouses and more than 20 Grade 3 powerhouses. It was because of their powerful deterrence that the Grade 4 Pale, which entrenched in the Echo Islands, did not dare to act rashly. Otherwise, the casualties caused by the witch disaster to the elves on the periphery of the Callan continent would be much more than this. In the past, every time the witch disaster broke out, the forest elves of the Callan continent had to suffer terrible casualties. This time, the main force of the Witch Coalition was blocked outside the coastline, making it difficult for them to set foot on the Callan continent. However, the Pale Witches were not weak either. However, just as the allied forces of Greenwater City were defending this place impeccably, they suddenly received a series of warning signals from their flank and rear. It seemed that an evil team of witches had sneaked into the magic forest from the west coast, taking advantage of the chaos to attack an elven town near Greenwater City. And the elven troops sent by Greenwater City had chased this evil team all the way from the west coast across thousands of miles of forest road unexpectedly crashing into the outer defense line of Greenwater City. In the depths of the dark and deep magic forest, a large number of elves had gathered and were searching the nearby mountains inch by inch, trying to find the evil team. After hearing the news, Greenwater City also sent a Windrunner team to join the search team. Thus, the war on the south coast inexplicably heated up again. Echo Islands. Up to 34 elven warships were cruising around the reef, while a large group of Windrunners circled above the Echo Isles, using the weapons in their hands to attack the buildings on the main island. The witches used the terrain here to build a large number of solid and reliable witchcraft buildings. At the edge of the main island, there were many defense towers, whose bottom was connected to the main building, the small wizard tower. They could absorb the magic energy of the wizard tower to activate energy shields and attack spells. That was why, before these defensive towers were pushed down, the Windstalkers could only circle the skies above the main island, unable to send any ground troops inside. Every time they swooped down, they had to take the risk of being hit by the defensive tower spells, such as fireballs, energy balls, wind blades, frost arrows, and acid balls. Only then could they use their explosive arrows or berserk spears to wear down the thickness of the energy barrier. With this small wizard tower, the Pale Witches had resisted several large-scale attacks by the Windrunners. On the other hand, the Witches' losses were 0, while the Elves' losses had accumulated to over 100. More than 100 of them were elite Elves who had the status of combatants. Normally, this number would be enough to make the Elven commander behind the scenes feel distressed and unable to sleep for a few days. But now, it had become the price to pay to suppress the arrogance of the Witches. Every time the Elves suffered a certain degree of damage, the Elven powerhouses hidden in the warships would swarm out, using their powerful individual abilities to attack everything on the island. And every time this happened, it was time for the top powerhouses of both sides to clash. It seemed that the battle between the powerhouses had been brought forward after hearing about the enemy situation in the rear defensive line. When 2 Grade 4 Elven oracles appeared in the sky above the main island, the Windrunners responsible for attacking immediately began to retreat. Meanwhile, on the massive reef island, a Tier 4 Pale Witch sneered as she floated up to sure foam. "Urso, Jivelier, you two still dare to come? What, haven't you suffered enough last time? Remura, don't be so smug. You didn't have it easy in the last battle, and you were still injured by my hands. Humph, one day, we'll smash your turtle shell into pieces." This was clearly not the first time the two sides had come into contact. Over the past few days, in order to end the witch calamity as soon as possible, the Elven powerhouses had taken turns to attack, wanting to flatten this eyesore reef island. However, the other party had the support of the Magus Tower, and she was actually able to block multiple Grade 4 Elven powerhouses by herself. As a result, both sides could only rely on this meaningless war of words to kill time. Both sides could not agree with each other, and after a few words, they would start fighting. On the Elven side, Urso, male, was the Grade 4 oracle of the god of archery, Marco, while Jivelier, female, was the Grade 4 oracle of the Elven main god, Sylvia. One of them was the main attacker, while the other was the support. Even against the Pale Witch, Remura, they could only fight to a draw. Seeing that the Grade 4 powerhouses were about to fight, the elves who had gathered around immediately turned around and fled, not even daring to stay to watch the battle. Urther was a middle-aged male elf with a sturdy figure and a determined and calm face. He wore earth-yellow elven leather armor, had short green hair, and pointed and long ears that reached into his temples. On his back was a quiver of strangely shaped magic arrows, and in his left hand was a magic longbow that was painted with rose branches and exquisite patterns. At his waist was a curved elven scimitar. He did not shout or make any movements. Instead, he raised his left hand and lightly pulled the incomparably tough bowstring with his right hand. With the sizzling sound of magic power gathering on his bowstring, a magic arrow condensed from the pure force of nature appeared automatically. Urso gave a low shout, and the magic arrow instantly turned into a green bolt of lightning, traversing nearly 1,000 meters to appear in front of Remura. With their strength, 1,000 meters was no longer a hindrance to their attacks. As long as they willed it, any attack they launched could appear at any location that they could lock onto with their eyes or spirit at will. The elven longbow in Urso's hands was not an ordinary item. It was a famous Grade 4 treasure in the entire Fairplane, Zodalil, the Wrath of the Stars. This was a semi-divine weapon. It had 3 strange magical effects: critical hit, strong attack, and penetration. Furthermore, this Zodalil Wrath of the Stars had been blessed by the god of archery, so when the bowstring was pulled, it would automatically produce magic arrows. There was no need for additional arrows. Faced with this magic arrow that shone with countless magical lights, Remura did not dare to take it head-on, even with the energy shield of the Wizard Tower. With a quick flash, Remura instantly appeared 100 meters away. After using the flash to dodge Urso's attack, Remura was not to be outdone. He raised his hand, and a translucent, ghastly claw shot out, whistling through the air as it grabbed at his opponent. When the ghastly claw first appeared, it was only the size of a wash basin. However, as a large amount of wizard power was injected into it from the wizard's pagoda, the ghastly claw grew larger and larger. By the time it reached Urso and G. Velver, it was already half an acre in size. The ghastly claw was surging with energy. The aura of negative energy instantly dyed the entire airspace into a gloomy gray. Faced with such a large area of effect attack, Urso did not quickly dodge. Instead, he calmly prepared for his next attack. G. Velver, who was standing beside him, let out a cry and waved the short and exquisite staff of nature in her hand. A large area of purification light enveloped the two of them. Wizard spells filled with negative energy were most afraid of this kind of purification light. The ghastly claw, which had been ferocious a moment ago, immediately collapsed the moment it came into contact with the purification light. It turned into a gloomy gray fog that slowly dissipated between the heavens and the earth. At this moment, the Wrath of the Stars in Urso's hand had already been fully drawn. What was shocking was that this time, 3 magic arrows imbued with the explosive aura of nature were formed on the bowstring at the same time. Bang! With the sound of the bowstring exploding, the 3 magic arrows left the bowstring. One of the magic arrows exploded with a powerful aura of nature. As it flew, it transformed into a terrifying nature spell, Nature's Wrath. This was a Grade 4 nature spell. The moment it exploded, it would trigger the power of nature within it and cause terrifying magic damage to the enemy. On the other hand, the 2 magic arrows silently disappeared into the air, making it difficult to detect their whereabouts. Invisible Arrow. This was a secret archery skill that the god of archery, Marco, had bestowed upon the elves. Faced with the Grade 4 Oracle Urso's all-out attack, the previously relaxed Remura could not help but feel nervous. What she was afraid of was not the Grade 4 Nature's Wrath, but the 2 invisible magic arrows. No matter how powerful a spell was, it needed to hit a person in order to exert its power. Although the power of Nature's Wrath was strong, it could not break through the defensive spell of the Grade 4 Pale Witch. Remura raised her head and let out a shrill, ear-piercing howl. The terrifying sound waves rippled in all directions. The Nature's Wrath was weakened by the Banshee's howl. By the time it hit Remura's undead soul barrier, it was already an arrow at the end of its flight. It did not even make a splash before disappearing. The terrifying sound waves spread out over a large area, forcing out an invisible arrow from 300 meters away. As soon as the invisible arrow appeared, it immediately burst out with a sharp sound and pierced towards Remura's forehead. The undead soul barrier was good for defensive spells, but it was not enough for physical defense. Therefore, Remura's figure flashed, and she once again dodged the attack. Chapter 672. One was in the light, and the other was in the dark. This invisible arrow was really hard to deal with. This time, there was no way to dodge. Rhaenyra was slightly stunned, and the arrow nailed straight into her forehead. With a crisp sound, the witch's skull exploded. Red blood and white flesh splattered in all directions like raindrops. Suddenly, a stinking bloody rain fell from the sky, and the headless corpse twitched and fell from the sky. The grade 4 witch was killed, just as the elves watching the battle in the distance suddenly burst into cheers. The two elven messengers standing in the void did not have any joy on their faces. They looked at each other with a serious expression, moved closer to each other, and began to scan the void around them. If these evil witches from the sorcerer world were so easy to kill, they would not have become a terrible tumor in the Faron Plain. Therefore, not only did the two elven messengers not let their guard down, but they also became even more vigilant. User pulled his bow and arrow, guarding beside Jivelier. The messenger of the elven god Silvio waved the staff of nature and began to softly chant a magic incantation. Listening to the syllables of the incantation, it seemed that she wanted to activate a field of truth to investigate the situation. However, at this moment, User, who was in charge of guarding, suddenly shouted in a low voice, "Be careful." Immediately after, his bowstring exploded, and two magic arrows drew a mysterious path in the air, landing in the void 100 meters away. With a light bang, the arrows exploded, and in an instant, the magic arrows actually transformed into two nature spells, Vine Spell and Nature's Imprisonment. Magic vines that spread out from the void were as flexible as snakes, wrapping around a strange human figure. On the outside, a small cage made of rose branches and green vines was rapidly forming. However, through the dense vines and vines, Urso's keen eyes could immediately tell that the one trapped was not the Tier 4 Pale Witch's main body, but a terrifying blood corpse overflowing with blood and pus. The blood corpse had no skin, and its entire body was naked. The surface of its body was covered with dripping blood and abscesses of all sizes. Due to being tightly bound, the blood corpse ignored the tough vines and thorns that pierced into its flesh and continued to struggle and twist crazily. The horrifying blood splashed onto the enchanted vines and magic thorns, producing a sizzling sound of corrosion that made one's teeth ache and legs go weak. Thick, pungent white smoke followed. This blood corpse possessed boundless strength and was unafraid of death. Its blood was actually no different from strong acid, possessing extremely terrifying corrosive properties. Seeing that the previous two binding spells were no longer able to restrain the enemy, Urso drew his bow again. This time, he didn't use a magic-infused arrow, but a real enchanted explosive arrow. It was still easier to kill a demonic magical creature like the blood corpses with powerful physical attacks. However, just as the exploding arrows were about to be fired, the void behind the two elf oracles rippled, and a nearly transparent humanoid figure emerged. This was a powerful spirit body that had reached the 4th grade, and her ethereal appearance was somewhat similar to that of Marat. As soon as she emerged from the void, before the two elf oracles could react, the terrifying spirit body opened her small mouth and let out a shrill and terrifying howl. Banshee's howl. This time, it was a true Banshee's howl. Its power was several times stronger than the one Rhaenyra had just cast. The terrifying howl's sound waves slammed into the void like waves. Not to mention fragile flesh, even space that was hard to touch began to crack and shatter under the attack of the howl. The violent and ferocious sound waves rapidly spread to the surroundings, catching up to the fleeing windwalkers in the distance at lightning speed. The latter, on the other hand, was more like a bunch of toy blocks that were crazily crushed by an invisible giant hand. In the blink of an eye, they were folded and squeezed into a photo before they exploded into pieces of flesh and a crimson rain of blood. Regardless of whether they were grade 1 or grade 2, it was difficult for them to escape from such a terrifying Banshee's howl. At this moment, they were like a group of helpless mortals that could be manipulated and trampled by a powerful god. They did not even have the ability to resist. Only the grade 3 elves could rely on their own explosive energy field to resist such a terrifying sound wave attack, and then flee for their lives. However, for this, they paid an extremely heavy price. Apart from the sound wave attack, the Banshee's Howl also carried a terrifying soul attack. While killing the other party, it could also shatter their soul. Thus, individuals killed by the Banshee's Howl could not be revived with resurrection spells or divine spells. If the distant sky was like this, the two elf oracles that were close to the Banshee's Howl directly suffered nearly 80% of the attack's power, and the damage they suffered was even greater than that of ordinary elves. Fortunately, they had experience fighting against the Pale Witch. Thus, the moment they sensed danger, the two elf oracles simultaneously activated the life-saving divine spell bestowed by their god, Divine Barrier. A layer of golden barrier appeared around them, blocking all the sound wave attacks for them without any danger. Under the protection of the Divine Barrier, the two elf oracles angrily turned around and immediately used their most powerful means to deal with this powerful spirit that suddenly appeared out of nowhere. This companion spirit belonged to Remura and flew around in all directions to avoid the attacks of the two elf oracles. At the same time, it did its best to activate all kinds of soul abilities, smashing into the Divine Barrier and shattering its bones. As expected of a mysterious power that was purer and more high-end than wizard power and magic, the shield made of divine power was able to resist all known witchcraft and spells, including those obscure spells that almost no one cared about. Seeing that its attacks could not break through the Divine Barrier, the companion spirit could only give up on its attack and began to escape the attack range of the two elf oracles. But how could the angry elf oracles let it leave so easily? G. Velvet's face was flushed red. She raised the staff of nature in her hand, and a dazzling light of nature shone from the tip of the staff and firmly locked on to the companion spirit. Although the companion spirit was an incorporeal body that could resist 100% of physical attacks, it also had to withstand 200% of magic attacks. Therefore, when the light of nature fell on the companion spirit, it was as if it was soaked in a bucket of strong acid. Its entire incorporeal body began to evaporate, and thick, pungent white smoke began to rise. The companion spirit raised its head and let out a shrill scream of pain. It began to flash and fly quickly in the air. Unfortunately, no matter how it tried to escape, the terrifying light of nature was still firmly locked onto its body, using the terrible purification power to quickly wear down its body. As if sensing the companion spirit's pain, the Pale Witch, Ramura, who had been in hiding, appeared once more. This time, as soon as she appeared, she quickly transformed into a terrifying dark tentacle monster. Her entire body was shrouded in thick black smoke. She waved dozens of dark tentacles that were as thick as stone pillars and tens of meters long, and swung them at the two elf oracles from all directions. Urso, who was in charge of protection, released a string of magic arrows that shot the dark tentacles in the air. However, these dark tentacles were obviously not that easy to destroy. Under the control of Ramura's spell, the scattered dark matter once again condensed into a new dark tentacle and extended towards the two elf oracles. Relying on a steady stream of regeneration, the black tentacles finally broke through User's blockade of arrows and lashed out at the Divine Barrier protecting G. Velvet. Like a rubber ball that had been whipped by a strong force, G. Velvet could not stabilize her body, and with a whoosh, she flew 200 to 300 meters in the air. Although the Divine Barrier blocked all the damage for her, this unstoppable shock still interrupted her light of nature. The companion spirit, whose body had been eroded by a small part of it, wailed mournfully. It used dense negative energy to extinguish the force of nature on the surface of its body, and with its eyes burning with green soul fire, it stared fiercely at G. Velvet and hatefully hid its body again. The two elf gods used their field of truth to sweep the sky, but they still could not find any trace of the companion spirit. Therefore, they could only target Ramura's body, and once again engaged her in a fierce battle above the Echo Islands. With two Tier 4 elves against a single Tier 4 pale, which, it might seem like they had the numerical advantage. However, in actual combat, it was still difficult for the elf oracles to have an absolute advantage. After all, every pale, which had a companion spirit that was cultivated since childhood. The companion spirit's strength was comparable to the pale witch's body, and their minds were connected. Therefore, a pale, which was actually equivalent to the fusion of two rank 4 witches. It was just that one had a physical body, while the other was just a spirit body. The witch Ramura's body was proficient in all kinds of powerful dark element wizard spells, while her companion spirit was proficient in all kinds of soul abilities. The two complemented each other, and the superposition of their combat power was much better than the self-righteous cooperation of the two elf divine oracles. However, the elf divine oracles had the support of gods and could obtain some powerful divine spells. The pale which had the wizard tower behind her and could escape into the protective barrier of the wizard tower the moment she felt that the battle was unfavorable. Therefore, both sides had their own strengths, and without absolute numbers, it was almost impossible to completely overwhelm the other party. Although there were 5 level 4 divine oracles in Greenwater City, once they came out in full force, Ramura would obediently hide in the wizard's pagoda and never show her face. With a level 4 witch overseeing it, it would be difficult for the elves to attack the wizard's pagoda even if they went all out. Moreover, even if they were willing to pay a huge price to flatten the wizard's pagoda, there was no way they could completely keep the level 4 witch here. With the methods of the witches, they could still build another nest elsewhere without the Echo Islands. When that time came, it would be the elves who would have a headache. Therefore, after trying a few times, the elves also gave up the idea of completely destroying their opponent and changed to a method of heavy defense to drag out the witch disaster with difficulty. Chapter 673. The battle between Grade 4 powerhouses was extremely shocking to the ordinary elves. Over 20 elven warships pulled out their anchors and set sail, hiding far away from the Echo Islands. Even after they had sailed 4 to 5 nautical miles away, they could still sense the intensity of the energy explosions through the chaotic winds blowing through the warships. There was no longer a single cloud in the azure sky. Dense, gloomy clouds converged from all directions and condensed into a boiling and rolling fog, firmly trapping the entire Echo Islands inside. The elves rushed to the deck of the warships, raising their heads and gazing in the direction of the Echo Islands, awaiting the triumphant return of the two elven oracles. The waves gradually became turbulent, and the warships began to shake along with them. Some elves who had never experienced such a thing before quickly developed severe symptoms of seasickness and began to vomit. Meanwhile, the high-ranking elves gathered at the bow of the warships, anxiously waiting for the results of the battle. Against a battle between Tier 4 powerhouses, let alone ordinary elves, even Tier 3 powerhouses did not dare to rashly interfere. At the start of the battle, the terrifying banshees' howl easily overturned a radius of 3 miles, instantly shredding the souls of all Tier 1 and Tier 2 elves in the area. The Tier 3 elf who barely managed to escape also suffered significant soul damage and needed to be sent back to Greenwater City to recuperate. Hence, for safety's sake, the fleet commander discussed with the Windwalker leader and decided to pull the fleet 6 nautical miles away from the Echo Islands, where they would silently await news from the front lines. However, before they could receive any news, they were greeted by a terrifying natural disaster. Perhaps it was the witch's sorcery or the phenomenon caused by the battle, but the distant Echo Islands were tightly sealed by a thick black fog. Amidst the black fog that was hard to see through, the violent flashes of lightning and the terrifying elemental quakes also made every elf secretly apprehensive. Just as everyone anxiously raised their heads, a shrill, ear-piercing voice came from the bow of the warship. "Hurry! Raise the shields! Quick! Get them to raise the nature barrier." The elves turned around in shock, discovering that the person who had screamed was a Tier 2 elven prophet. This elven prophet belonged to the Temple of Fortune. She was a beautiful, elegant, middle-aged female elf. But at this moment, she seemed to be frightened by something unknown. Two thin lines of blood flowed down from her closed eyes. However, she didn't care about this at all. She just continued to scream crazily. Although the prophet profession did not have any combat power, in the Elven Kingdom, no one dared to ignore their opinions. Therefore, the fleet commander immediately ordered the orderlies to activate the natural barrier. These warships belonged to the standard naval ships of the Elven Kingdom. The secret chamber at the bottom of the cabin was specially engraved with an elven magic circle that could activate a large natural barrier. Normally, in order to conserve energy, it would not be activated. Now, although they had yet to sense the impending danger, the fleet commander was still cautious and decided to heed the elven prophet's warning. As expected, as soon as the elven warships erected green natural barriers that shrouded their entire warships, a water line that was several meters high surged towards them silently from the sea level in the distance. And in front of the water line, above the surface of the sea, a violent hurricane swept across the land. The warships that were protected by the natural barrier were still in good condition. Apart from the violent ups and downs, they didn't suffer much damage. However, the aerial troops that were flying high in the blue sky and in charge of monitoring the nearby seas and airspace were in big trouble. The violent hurricane was like a wall of wind, instantly wrapping around the hippogriffs, chimeras, and silver pegasi, making it hard for them to distinguish which direction they were in. All of them were like spinning tops that were whipped by a naughty child, falling from the sky without any chance to struggle. As for the elven archers and knights on their backs, they fell into the sea like dumplings. After the wall of wind passed, the water line behind it arrived. More than 20 warships were swept up by the undulating waves and collided with one another. If not for the protection of a natural barrier, this huge wave would have flipped over half of the elven warships. In an instant, the elves were in a panic. But that wasn't the end. After the wall of wind and the huge wave passed, the pitter-patter of the black rain began to pour down again. This black rain with a thick stench and corrosive smell fell on the natural barrier, annihilating and neutralizing the force of nature. Wisps of black smoke began to rise. The entire elven fleet immediately fell into chaos. All the Grade 1 elves hurriedly hid in the belly of the ship to avoid harm from the harsh environment. Those who could move around on the surface of the ship had to be at least Grade 2. All the Grade 3 elves gathered at the bow of the ship, not caring about the danger these strange phenomena posed to the fleet. Instead, they focused their attention on the black fog in the distance. After all, this was only the aftermath of the battle between the Grade 4 powerhouses. The real calamity was still trapped in that layer of fog. There, the Echo Archipelago that had existed for thousands of years was suffering an unprecedented calamity. On the outskirts of the Echo Archipelago, the reefs that had withstood the impact and erosion of the violent waves for hundreds of years were being shaved inch by the violent and ferocious winds. In the entire Echo Archipelago, other than the energy barrier erected by the Wizard Tower on the main island, which was not destroyed by the aftermath of the battle between the Grade 4 powerhouses, the rest of the reefs that were exposed on the surface of the water were almost gone. Whether it was the natural spells of the elf oracles mixed with divine power, or the super-powerful wizard spells cast by the pale witches with the power of the wizard's pagoda, they all caused irreparable damage to the world. Compared to the small fights between the Grade 2 and Grade 3 powerhouses, the Grade 4 powerhouses could easily unleash a terrifying attack that could destroy the world. And the area covered by their spells was surprisingly large, easily overturning a radius of 3 to 4 miles. Within the area covered by their spells, there were almost no obvious areas with strong or weak energy. This also fully showed that the understanding and mastery of the spells of the Grade 4 powerhouses had reached an appalling level, and the battle between the Pale Witches and the Elf Oracles had finally angered another powerful force. The sea around the Echo Archipelago suddenly began to boil as if it was boiling, and a huge 6-meter-tall sea demon slowly rose from the water. It had a huge and strong body, with a humanoid torso and arms, and its skin was dark greenish-gray. On its neck was a strange, spindle-shaped head, with a ferocious face, two especially sharp and slender fangs protruding from its lower lip, and two strands of whalebone hanging under its chin could not stop wriggling. The lower body of the siren was still a flat and long snake tail, which was covered with fine indigo scales. And this sea demon that appeared was also a grade 4 powerhouse. Its green webbed right hand was holding a rusty trident, floating on the surface of the water. It raised the trident high up and shot a column of water at the people who were fighting fiercely. Seeing that there was an outsider intervening, the pale witches and the elf oracles immediately separated, each looking at the newcomer with cold eyes. Elf, which, no matter what reason you have, you are not allowed to fight in the territory of the sea tribe. The sea demon roared hoarsely. The sea tribe of the Faran Plain used a special sea creature language, but fortunately, the people present were the top figures of their respective forces and had a certain degree of research on this sea tribe language, so there was no problem of whether they could understand it or not. Since ancient times, the arrogant sea tribe had not been on good terms with all the land races. Even with the power of the Elven Kingdom, if they wanted to build their own elven warships to sail in the endless deep sea, they had to pay a large amount of tribute to the sea tribe. Otherwise, the only ending would be the destruction of the ships and the deaths of the people. Therefore, in the face of this arrogant and overbearing grade 4 sea demon, even if the two elf oracles were extremely angry, they could only restrain their temper and argue. This battle was not caused by us. As a member of the Faran Plain, I think you have the obligation and responsibility to protect the peace of the entire plane. Why don't you join us in driving this invader out of our world? Kakik, you may not like these witches, but we quite like them. They have given us many good things as tribute. Hearing the sea demon's words, the two elf oracles looked furious. G. Velvet even said angrily, "How can you make a deal with a group of invaders from another world? Do you still have the right to call yourself a member of the Faran Plain?" Faced with this female elf's accusation, the evil sea demon revealed a look of mockery. "They're just a group of witches. You may be afraid of them, but we are not. If they really dare to cause trouble for the sea tribe, we will tear them into pieces and leave them without a whole corpse." Having said this, the sea demon narrowed her eyes, which were filled with a murderous intent, and carefully scanned G. Velvet's exquisite and curvy body a few times. Then, she revealed a lewd and evil smile. "Lass, if you are willing to come to my coral sea as a guest for a few days, I can make the decision to drive this witch away from the island. What do you think?" Hearing this, the expressions of the two elves changed completely. G. Velvet was so angry that her body trembled, and her eyes were spitting fire. "Watch your words, sea tribe. You are insulting the oracle of a great god. Do you want to start a war between the two pantheons?" User hurriedly stopped the enraged G. Velvet and came forward to negotiate with the sea demon. A war between pantheons? The sea demon seemed to be a reckless person and curled her lips in disdain. "Do you think that weak little bean sprout god of yours is worthy of challenging the great Atri?" Umph. The two elf oracles were immediately angered to the point of exploding, but then they understood something from the sea demon's words. You're the oracle of Atri?" It was only now that the two elf oracles sensed a trace of familiarity from the sea demon's cold and cryptic energy undulations. The sea demon was also an oracle, and an oracle of the most ruthless and cruel sea beast god, Atri. Chapter 674. As natives of the Faran Plain, the two elven oracles naturally knew of the sea beast god Atri. Most of the gods were superior beings that surpassed the mortals of the world, possessing great power and extraordinary wisdom that the mortals could not hope to match. The god of sea beasts, Atri, was a special case. He was ignorant and chaotic, and even his intelligence was incomplete. However, he was helpless against the fact that he possessed great strength and a powerful body that far surpassed ordinary gods. Even without those fancy spells and battle techniques, he could easily defeat half of the gods of the elven pantheon with just his physical strength. There was no helping it, as more than half of the elven pantheon's gods were not good at battle. Moreover, Atri, who possessed tyrannical, cruel, regenerative, and other divine concepts, was especially worshipped and admired by all the powerful sea beasts. Based on the total area of the sea and the Faran Plain and the number of living creatures, the number of powerful sea beasts far exceeded the total number of forest elves. With the support of such a large amount of faith, even though the sea beast god's intelligence was severely lacking, he was still pushed into the ranks of the powerful gods, becoming the second most powerful god in the Faran Plain, second only to the sea god Diots. If the battlefield was in the sea, Atri alone would be enough to wipe out the entire elven pantheon. This was not to mention the sea god Diots, who had the title of Berserker Lord. Hence, under the teachings of the sea beast god Atri, the powerful sea folk who worshipped him were all brainless and arrogant. However, a grade 4 idiot was still not someone ordinary people could easily provoke. Left with no choice, Urso and Jivelier could only swallow their anger and withdraw from the battle. When the two elven oracle's figures disappeared into the horizon, the grade 4 siren's gaze landed on the pale witch Ramura. "Hey, ugly woman from the Magus world, when will you deliver the blood of the sea that you promised? If I find out that you're lying, I'll bring my men and smash your stupid Shadow Island." Blood of the Sea was just an elegant name, but it was actually just the blood of the powerful sea beasts of the Magus world. As sea beasts of a high-level world, their blood was undoubtedly an extremely precious tonic to the sea tribe of the Faran Plain. The blood of the sea that the sea monster in front of him needed was naturally the blood of the sea monster, which was of the same origin as it. Even the northern witches did not have such a rare resource in stock, so they could only send people to the depths of the ocean of the sorcerer world to look for it. After finding it, they would need to organize a team to hunt it down, so the difficulty of obtaining it was quite high. Faced with the Tier 4 siren's insane words, although the pale, which Ramura's expression changed, she did not fall out with it. In the Faran Plain, the pale witches could afford to offend the elven divine clan, and they could fight against the human divine clan. But the only thing they didn't dare to offend was the berserk sea tribe. In the Faran Plain, the total surface area of the ocean was more than 100 times the total surface area of the land. Coupled with the abundance of biological resources, the number of experts of the sea tribe was staggering. This sea demon emissary was not just bluffing when she said that she would destroy Shadow Island at every turn. If they really forced this fellow to fall out with them, it would not be difficult for her to go to the depths of the ocean and summon double digits of Tier 4 sea beasts to invade the Dark Shadow Island. Although the Dark Shadow Island had been fortified by the Pale Witches for the past 1,000 years, when faced with double digits of Tier 4 sea beasts, all of which were as large as small mountains, the defensive towers and energy barriers were simply a joke. Lady Basida, you can't blame us for dragging it out for so long. Faced with the unreasonable sea demon, Ramura could only smile bitterly and explain, "If you could provide us with some of your own blood, we would naturally be able to find suitable prey for you. But you refuse to provide us with your blood. So the 3 samples we previously provided were unable to completely match your blood essence. In the vast and boundless depths of the Sorcerer's Sea, it would be quite a challenge for us to find the sea demon tribe that suits your needs." "If I don't care. You want my blood? Don't even think about it. You witches love to play with strange things. Who knows what you'll do with my blood?" The level 4 sea demon in front of her seemed foolish, but she was also shrewd. She waved the trident in her hand angrily. "I'll give you at most 10 more years. If I don't get the blood of the ocean you promised within 10 years, you could just wait to get lost from the Faran dimension." After roaring for a while, the level 4 sea demon turned around and dove into the sea, disappearing without a trace. Ramura sighed inwardly and silently returned to the wizard's pagoda on the main island with her companion spirit. The entire Echo archipelago had gone through this calamity. Almost all of the outer islands had been destroyed, becoming submerged reefs hidden under the surface of the sea. This also made the waters around the Echo archipelago even more complicated and difficult to traverse. But Rhaenyra did not have the slightest interest in dealing with this. Instead, she hid in her residence and silently contacted the Level 4, which overseeing the Dark Shadow Island. The so-called blood of the ocean should be left to the leaders and elders of the family to deal with. Callan Continent, Eagle Nest Mountain. As a well-known magical beast nest near the south coast, a group of wind eagles lived here. The wind eagles were wind element magical beasts native to the Callan Continent. They had unparalleled flying speed and powerful wind element spells. An adult wind eagle only had the abilities of a level 1 beginner. It did not sound very powerful, but they were magical beasts that lived in groups. On the sunny side of a towering cliff, over 100 wind eagles built densely packed nests on the cliff wall, breeding and living here. Over time, the number of wind eagles increased, and it became a place where elves tamed magical beasts and druids summoned their animal companions. And this place became the famous Eagle Nest Mountain. As a type of flying magical beast with shocking intelligence, the wind eagles had always had a good relationship with the elves. Furthermore, they were very protective of their territory. They would launch the most ferocious attack against any bird or beast that trespassed into their territory. So, within a 5-mile radius of the Eagle Nest Mountain, there were no powerful creatures that could pose a threat to the young wind eagles. But these days, the Eagle Nest Mountain had lost its former peace and tranquility. It had become chaotic and violent. And the cause of all this was a group of abominable bugs. 7 days ago, a large group of black, evil alien beetles surged out of the depths of the forest. They plunged into the underground of the Eagle Nest Mountain and hid there, never to come out again. The large group of elves and AI, the Spear of Vengeance, were blocked by an overwhelming number of adult wind eagles as soon as they rushed 3 miles into the Eagle Nest Mountain. This was the critical time for the young wind eagles to hatch. Even though the wind eagles had always been on good terms with the elves, they would not allow the elves to use their nest as a battlefield. The Spear of Vengeance, was immediately enraged by this group of short-sighted magical beasts that blocked her way. If the leader of the elves hadn't pulled her back, would have had to fight the wind eagles before eliminating the swarm of bugs. These little wind eagles, which were only rank 1 and rank 2, wouldn't even last 1 round against the rank 3 Spear of Vengeance. More than half of them would die. But if did this, the good relationship between the forest elves and the wind eagles would come to an end. Left with no choice, the horned eagle archers could only stay at the outskirts of the Eagle Nest Mountain, keeping an eye on the bugs and making sure they didn't escape. The leader of the elves flew directly to Greenwater City, which was less than 700 miles away from the Eagle Nest Mountain, and sent a request for assistance to the elven commander there. Thus, half a day later, a group of less than 1,000 windrunners arrived at the Eagle Nest Mountain. It had to be said that faced with such a troublesome situation, the elves couldn't do anything no matter how many troops they gathered. That was because the enemy was dead set on hiding underground and wouldn't come out to fight them again. There were 20 to 30 million forest elves in the Elven Kingdom, and they naturally had all kinds of talents. Some of them had accurate archery, some were agile, some could use powerful natural spells, and some could transform into various magical beasts, but when it came to fighting underground, there wasn't a single one of them that was strange. That's right, the forest elves were strange creatures that yearned for nature and loved freedom and art. How could they give birth to a strange species that was adept at fighting underground? Thus, when 1,000 elves surrounded the Eagle Nest Mountain, the biggest problem was how to chase the enemy out. Smoke, water, fire, repelling the snakes. They used all kinds of strange methods, but they didn't manage to force the insect which bliss out. Instead, the young eagles that had just hatched from the Eagle Nest Mountain suffered quite a bit. Thus, The elven commander of Greenwater City could only use all kinds of methods to coax and pester the Wind Eagles to move to another area to rest for the time being. After vacating the battlefield, the elves dug down the foot of the Eagle Nest Mountain without a care for their own safety, wanting to dig out the bugs that had harmed so many elves and exterminate them. Unfortunately, under the command of the insect witch Bliss, the swarm of bugs was much more cunning than most magical beasts. The tunnels they dug underground were only a meter thick and couldn't accommodate the elves' movements at all. Their main area of activity was concentrated at the bottom of the Eagle Nest Mountain, where the rock layer was especially thick. This made it more difficult for the elves to dig. Helpless, the elven commander gathered a large number of druids that could turn into rock pythons or ground blindness worms, and had them turn into earth-type magical beasts to chase the hateful bugs underground. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.